Good morning. I'd like to call this meeting to order. The time is 9:10, and one moment. And today is Thursday, November 4th, 2021. This is a one-day meeting of the Physical Therapy Board of California, and today we're meeting virtually by WebEx. This is an official business meeting of the Physical Therapy Board of California, and the board's role during the pandemic continues to be to maintain consumer protection and consult with local and state entities on the laws and regulations pertaining to the physical therapy industry. I would also like to explain how this meeting will be conducted. We do have a moderator from the Department of Consumer Affairs online to help us today. Individuals listening to the meeting will have an opportunity to provide public comment and will be assisted by a moderator who will be facilitating the teleconferencing process. We will take public comment on specific agenda items, and at both the beginning and the end of the meeting, there will be a comment session for items that are not on the agenda. Public comments must be specific to the agenda item that is being discussed. If you make a comment during the specific agenda item that is not related to the topic, you'll be placed on mute by the moderator. All comments that do not directly relate to an item on the agenda should be held until the agenda item for items not on the agenda. The board follows the Open Meeting Act, so while we accept and appreciate the public's comments, we cannot respond to those comments. For those members of the public participating via teleconference, please wait until the moderator has introduced you before you make your comments. The moderator will give instructions on how to participate at each opportunity for public comment. This meeting is being recorded and minutes of the meeting will be prepared. Can we please have roll call?
Alicia Renee
Here.
Dale Armstrong.
Present.
Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer. Daniel Drummer is absent. Katarina Elby.
Present.
Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian.
Present.
All members are present with the exception of Daniel Drummer and Jonathan Irvin, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you so much. And if we can please have a reading of the board's mission statement by Vice President Katarina Elby.
The mission of the Physical Therapy Board of California is to advance and protect the interests of the people of California by the effective administration of the Physical Therapy Practice Act.
Thank you, Vice President Elby. And skipping down to agenda item number 4 is our first opportunity for public comment on items not on the agenda. Moderator, can you please facilitate public comment?
Yes, this is the moderator. Members of the public, the Q&A is now open. You can access it by clicking on the Q&A icon, which is typically located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. It now looks like a small question mark inside of a black square. If you click on that, it will open the Q&A. It will give you a text box in which you can type, "I would like to make a public comment," and make sure you send that to all panelists. And when prompted, click the unmute me button. So these instructions will be placed on the screen each time public comment is requested. So I'll pause now for a moment just to allow members of the public time to access this feature. Board President, no requests have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and just before we start with agenda item number 5, I would like to thank everyone for their patience getting on today. Our executive officer proved to be a great tech support, and I'm confident I'm not going to be dropped. So that's a good thing. But I'd also like to just let you know how the morning will go. We're going to start with agenda item 5, work through that as much as possible until 11. So at 11, we're going to recess for closed session and then have a lunch break from 12 to 1, and we will reopen at 1 o'clock. So just want to give everyone a heads up on what we're planning to do. as of right now. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason Kaiser for agenda item number 5.
Thank you, Madam President. I do think we actually fit a little bit under agenda item number 6 for the discussion of possible board action, because there are some homework items left over from the last meeting.
Yes.
But I think would be better served to discuss those first and then go on to the report itself.
Yep.
So as the board knows, at the October 15th meeting, we met and started formulating sunset for the very first time. And one of the discussions that was had was what kind of issues we would be identifying as new issues in the future sunset report. Staff made a recommendation that we should consider taking one of the director's executive orders that waived an in-person evaluation by a physician or surgeon to continue direct access care and remove the words in person in statute via or by means of the sunset report itself. That conversation blossomed out a little bit, and we started talking about the idea of addressing direct access as a whole and whether or not it was time to remove direct access as a barrier to care for California consumers of physical therapy services. As part of that conversation, the board asked staff and I to reach out to stakeholders to kind of test the waters and feel what they might think of that idea. And so you asked us to reach out to the professional associations, specifically the California Physical Therapy Association, the California Medical Association, and the California Chiropractic Association. We were able to have conferences with 2 out of those 3. And in fact, we did receive contact from the 3rd yesterday, but they're not available to meet until probably sometime next month. So we were able to have a conversation with the California Physical Therapy Association. They were in support of that idea. It was in line with plans that they have as far as the association has put together a task force in their Legislative Affairs Committee to modernize the Practice Act. And one of the items to be modernized will be direct access. So they're very appreciative of that idea and well in support of it. Yesterday, we did have a meeting with members from the California Medical Association. And while they were very supportive of the idea of removing the word in person to allow for telemedicine telemedicine vehicles to achieve that evaluation to continue the plan of care, they were a bit resistant with the idea of removing direct access ideas altogether. So they asked a few questions. One of them is why? Why would we remove it altogether? And I think that they see the physician or surgeon signing off on the plan of care as an additional safeguard of consumer protection. They were interested in the idea of maybe looking at the 12 visits or 45 days and see if there's an adjustment to be made there. And then, also through that AB 1000 legislation that created direct access, there were a number of consumer safeguards built into the legislation. And so one of their concerns was, if we remove it altogether, are we also removing those safeguards as part of that conversation? And I think that's a little farther into the conversation than we got as a board. I don't think we discussed any of those things as far as removing the conflict of interest or financial interest statements that are included in AB 1000 or anything like that. I think we were a little bit more conceptual with the idea of just autonomy and not needing a physician or surgeon involved when physical therapy services are administered. But again, according to those representatives from the California Medical Association, there would certainly be contention and resistance if the board was to move forward with trying to remove or have unrestricted access altogether. We did talk about, some of the norms in the nation. 20 states in the United States have direct access, and then there are 27 states similar to California who have some kind of conditional direct access, whether that be through a number of visits in time or through certifying a physical therapist's qualifications, or even limiting what kind of services could be provided through direct access. It was a good conversation. They were amenable and easily engageable, but again, did we're quite frank in stating that should we move forward with that kind of pursuit through sunset, that the CMA would provide resistance to that idea. Having said that, members might recall, I cautioned any idea of having a contentious topic involved in a sunset bill. At this point, I think it's very clear that we can identify pursuing AB 1000 or changing AB 1000 to a full direct access would be considered a contentious topic for sunset. And not to say that it's not worthy of legislation in the future, I just would not recommend pushing it through as a part of our sunset bill and having to essentially not sacrifice, but unnecessarily expose just our sunrise in legislation to such a hot button issue. Any questions or comments?
I have a couple of questions. One is, did anyone from the CMA discuss their experience or other experiences of physicians with our 12-visit, 45-day, restrictions? Did anyone testify to how it's working, either beneficially or not beneficially? Because, I think if you polled some PTs, you'd probably get several answers. But like for myself, when care is interrupted because the patient can't get transportation or can't get into the doctor because the doctor doesn't have an opening, and then, we can't see them for a couple of weeks, and the patient's a high fall risk, that's difficult. I'm wondering if the physicians had any comment on the same. Like, we can't always get these people in, or we've never had a problem with this, or we have had a problem with PTs not sending them back in time. I don't know. Any comments on that at all?
They didn't bring it up directly in the conversation. I can tell you that I expressed those frustrations on behalf of the board to them. Excuse me. There was also conversation about this topic and its relation to the global pandemic and COVID-19, where members of the CMA did acknowledge that there is a difficulty and a backlog in patients being able to see a doctor or physician face-to-face, and that they are utilizing telemedicine at a very heavy rate at this point because of that. And I think all things considered, that's quite appropriate, and so I think they were seeing the ask of this question through that COVID lens. And I think that's why they were very open and amenable to the idea of removing in person. I don't know that those members of the CMA that we had this discussion with had the experiences per se as actual doctors and physicians with frustrations of patients receiving care or access or being inundated with those kind of requests. One of the things that we did kind of have to talk through was just kind of a historical account of how all this came about, and that prior to AB 1000, as long as a physical therapist had a diagnosis to practice from, that time period of when a physician or surgeon would have to be contacted, consulted, was ultimately based on that physical therapist's professional discretion, that when it was appropriate, they would refer back to a physician or surgeon. The restriction comes from AB 1000, where you can, as physical therapists, enter into that plan of care with a consumer absent a diagnosis, but limited to that 12 visits or 45 days. And I think there was some educating that occurred during that call as far as kind of the history. And by the midway through the conversation, they were very clear on where we were. There was some expression on the CMA's part that 12 visits or 45 days seemed kind of short, right? And so questions were asked where that number was, where that number came from. And I just told them, to my recollection, in the negotiations between the California Physical Therapy Association and the California Medical Association as it pertained to AB 1000, they looked at average times of how long a typical period of physical therapy services was. And while for some people it's very quick and short, you might see a PT 3 or 4 times and then you're ready to go. You might also have, patients that are recovering from some kind of reconstructive surgery or something a little bit more severe, and they may be in the 20 to 30 visits and going through PT for a much longer period of time. The averages were looked at and determined based on those two extremes, and so they picked the 12 visits or 45 days, thinking that would cover most common situations. A bit arbitrary, I think, but given the circumstances, that was the conversation between the two professional associations and bared out that particular piece of legislation. So today, they did ask, if I was aware of any kind of studies that would indicate better numbers. And I'm not, and I don't know that those studies would exist because the number was arbitrary to begin with. Changing it again, I believe, would be just kind of an arbitrary change. So extending it from 1245 to 2490 or something like that, may be a conversation worth having between the two professional associations again. But I think that's definitely one of the counterpoints that they're going to bring up in that conversation with any kind of change to direct access. But again, to answer your question, they didn't have the experiences firsthand that we have heard, through word of mouth from our licensees having, where once they hit that ceiling, sometimes it can be very difficult to get that patient back into having an in-person evaluation or consultation with a physician to have that plan of care signed off on. Which kind of, circling back, led to the recommendation of the director's waiver in the first place. When we were looking at COVID-19 and any kind of difficulties that COVID, or what kind of difficulties our own statutes would create for our patients and their ability to obtain services, staff identified that AB 1000's restrictions with that in-person evaluation could make it quite difficult for the continuity of care. And again, I think CMA was very amenable to the idea. I think it's very logical, reasonable, commonsensical. Our Practice Act and even AB 1000 was written prior to some of these technological advances, if you will. Even direct access, when AB 1000 was put into place, even telemedicine at that point was kind of in its infancy. And now we know that it's being used more commonplace, and there are a number of different vehicles that can be used for a physician or a surgeon to do that evaluation when appropriate through electronic means and save that consumer from having to actually go visit a physical office, find transportation, find time out of their day, that kind of thing. And then also have that plan of care signed off so that they have that continuity of care that we're hoping to achieve through direct access.
Yeah. And I would also add to the list that you just named for the consumer is the price of the MD visit too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which many times can be a barrier. Other board member thoughts, comments, questions?
Madam President, this is Jesus. I can chime in. So, to Mr. Kaiser's points, one, I'm actually heartened that the CMA is willing to start to think about this and not taking up a pretty hard line stance. So it seems to me that originally the 12 visits or 45 days was sort of based on a typical physical therapy course of care, course of treatment. And Jason, you mentioned something else. What seems to be a barrier now is just getting access to physicians, being seen by a physician. One nice thing about the governor's waiver is that I think that sort of removed a potential barrier, being able to actually not have to worry about transportation to the physician's office, but actually being able to do that via telemedicine. And the other thing is maybe it would be a good time to explore what I think might be another barrier is just the booking lead time to see a physician. So in other words, the 12 visits, 45 days, my impression was based on, again, the typical PT plan course of treatment. Maybe we need to start looking at booking lead times. I'm not suggesting it would be easy, but the data's got to be out there. I mean, medical offices have to have some record of how long is it taking, our physicians to see patients. So just a thought, might be a pretty ominous task to take on, but it wouldn't be impossible. It would just take a lot of effort. And again, if if the CMA is willing to look at that, I think it's worth pursuing again and sort of moving the needle a little bit in line with the direct access. Just a thought.
Thank you. Other board members?
This is Katerina. I agree with Dr. Dominguez that it's definitely worth pursuing. I just believe that, as Jason recommended, that post sunset would be a great time to tackle that, because, as you mentioned, it's not a great time for controversial decisions or motions or things like that. So that's my feedback.
Thank you, Kat. Tanya, Dale, anything to add?
No.
I agree with post sunset and possibly looking at increasing that 45 days and increasing the 12 visits.
Yeah.
I do agree, though.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. And thank you, Jason, for having that conversation with those stakeholders and bringing that information back for us. Enlightening the stuff. Thank you.
So to kind of focus in on the more narrow topic of how we're going to move forward through sunset, just want to get kind of a feel from the members if we're still all in agreement with the idea of extending the director's language, or at least coming up with something as similar to the director's language as possible, and proposing that it be codified in statute. And staff's recommendation is simply the removal of the word in person from the AB 1000 language. Is that something that the board would want us to continue moving forward with in crafting that and that language and working with council to make sure that all our bases are covered as well, but as a proposal? As I look at the AB 1000 statute, I think as simple as it may sound, I think the solution is essentially just removing the words in person. I think that gives us the effect in the statute that we're looking for.
When does that waiver end again?
So that waiver has been recently updated, but it expires December 31st of this year. And it will be the final extension of that waiver.
What do board members think about that proposal to remove the words in person? So that consumers can, yeah, go ahead, Dale.
Sorry, Alicia. I agree. I think that the good effect of that is that it would decrease the wait time for patients to get into the physician, because if the in-person is taken away, then they may be able to do a virtual visit and get the prescription sooner anyway.
This is Kat. I agree with Dale. I think that removing the word in person or the words in person is a fix that will accomplish what we're trying to accomplish.
This is
Tanya,
Jesus.
ditto.
Oh, sorry,
Ditto.
Tanya.
Oh, no, I was just saying ditto. I agree as well.
And I'm just going to add, and I agree with Dale and Kat and Tanya. And early on, I thought, well, let's just add in telemedicine. And I thought, wait a minute, I think to your point, Jason, just removing the in-person, because to be quite honest, I have no idea what the technology in the future is going to hold. So I think just removing that is a nice, clean, efficient way of addressing the issue.
Thank you, members. Staff, do we need a motion? Or is this something we can?
I think just from direction, you can, give us the go-ahead to move forward with crafting that, because while I'm saying removing in person, I would like to give you kind of a strikeout and underlined version of that document so you can read the context surrounding it, understand it fully. And then, in crafting it as a issue in to be identified in legislation through sunset, we'll continue to work with the committee, with Jesus and Tanya, in crafting that language and bring it forward at the December meeting, as well as a rationale that would be provided to the legislature of why we're making that recommendation.
Thank you. So it does sound like the 5 members present all agree this is the way to go. So we'll put it in the hands of the committee. Thank you, Tanya and Jesus, for serving on that committee and squaring everything up for us. But I think maybe right now, if we're at the end of this conversation, we can solicit some public comment if we have any public online. So moderator, can you please facilitate public comment for us?
This is the moderator. I've opened up the Q&A. Members of the public, if you would like to participate, the instructions are on the screen for your reference. You can click the Q&A icon, the question mark inside of black square at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. It will open the text box in which you can type in, I would like to make a public comment, and click send to all panelists. And when prompted, click the unmute me button. So I'll pause now to allow members of the public time to access the Q&A feature. No requests have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go forward with crafting that language and working with the committee and presenting the removal of in-person at the December meeting. One of the other tasks that was given to staff at the October 15th meeting was based on another recommendation of pursuing an extension of our statutory fee cap. The board asked if we would do some research into what the fees look like in other states and other professions. And so we have put together, which surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, you may be surprised how difficult that is actually to collect that information, moving from one state to another. Some of the fees for licensure in other states is not so readily available on the board's websites or even through email queries and phone call conversations. So, and every jurisdiction has kind of a unique way of calculating fees. And I learned a lot just through the pursuit of this. Some of the states actually will not post their fees in advance because they have an ongoing kind of recalculation based on how much money they've spent and then putting that back onto the licensing population the next renewal term, which I thought was rather interesting. Having said that, one of the things that I would like to say, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to say this, but California does not have the highest renewal fees in the United States. And I was fairly certain we did, which I thought was commensurate with the idea of also being the largest licensing population in the state. But we were beat out by another state who has a fee at $325 every 2 years. And then we do have quite a few ties, right? And so we have some that have a very similar fee to us, that $300 is collected every 2 years, or $150 is collected every year. So essentially being the same. While California has this kind of ongoing renewal process month to month based on a licensee's birth date, some states tend to process their renewals on a single date regardless of when that licensee was issued a license or when their birth date is. They process all the renewals that particular date so they can establish their revenue that way. We also looked internally at the Department of Consumer Affairs and some to our brothers and sister boards, and we did see some, compromise for us that some boards have recently increased their fees. There are quite a number of boards that have higher fees than physical therapists, medical board, the chiropractic board, registered nursing board, those kind of boards, especially the boards with smaller populations like the osteopathic medical board and the board of podiatry. The smaller the population, the smaller expenses to devise, through their licensing population, so their fees tend to be much higher. And sometimes double what we charge our licensees for a 2-year period. One of the things that we were looking at is trying to determine what kind of what cap would we recommend to the legislature moving forward. And I don't think there's any good way to go about doing that. Staff and I worked, trying to come up with some kind of formula, but I think it's a little bit more kind of commonsensical to that. If you look at what our statutory cap is now, it's at $300. But if we look back through the history of the board and its fee increases, over the last 10 years, we've increased the fees a number of times to get to that $300 cap. In fact, when I came to the board, we were in the middle of a transition of a renewal fee being $120 moving to $150. And so if you see that 120 and that 150, you had a pretty good cushion in cap up to that 300. Prior to 120, the renewal fee was only $75. So when we had a $75 renewal, we still had a $300 cap in statute. And so looking at that, my recommendation would be to ask for something like $500 in the cap. Right? It's not indicative of what we're going to be asking for in a fee increase, but it gives us room. Anytime that this board has proposed a fee increase in the past, we've had to justify that increase, whether it be through a cost-benefit analysis or just simple math, like we did the last time around, where we just had to show without a fee increase, the board would meet insolvency. So my recommendation to the board would be to ask the legislature for a $500 statutory cap.
What do board members think? What are your comments and questions?
Hey, Jason, it's Kat. I think that 500 is reasonable, especially based on the data that you just presented about other boards within our state that have higher fees. And also, it's enough wiggle room that if should we have the need to increase, we have that increased limit. So I would be amicable to that idea.
We're in this kind of weird crossroad point where the last time around, we asked for an increase in caps, but we didn't state an amount. And we thought that it would be up to the legislature to decide through whatever trust relationship there might be and whatever assessments that they had used for other boards and bureaus in the past. And we were unsuccessful. Granted, it was inopportune in the sense that we had just had a fee increase and our revenues were starting to flow well, and we didn't, the idea of an increase in caps was probably, looked at as being unnecessary by the legislature at the time. And so here we are, 6 years later, and having the same conversation. And that interesting crossroads is making that recommendation of 500. Is that too high? Is it not enough? Is it just a point of negotiation, a point to start with, going back and forth with staffers from the BMP committee? I don't know yet. I would tell you that even if they came back and rejected 500 and said, but we'll increase your statutory caps to 400, I would sleep better at night, right? I would have a little bit more, I would have a little less, actually, anxiety into the idea of, dealing with the unknown, right? Something to help save for a rainy day. And if anything emergent did happen, we would promulgate through regulation and increase in those fees. Incrementally somewhere within that range from 300 to 400 or straight to 400, depending on, what was appropriate. And then again, asking for 500, I think is kind of, we were trying to find kind of the middle of the road compromise based on kind of room we had to move in between 75 all the way to 300. And maybe I'm shooting too low, right? Maybe 500 isn't enough at that point for a statutory cap. What could happen if the legislature gave us another 5 years for a sunrise bill? What could happen 5 years from now? What would our fees look like? What would the fees look like for the profession across the United States? What would the fees look like for all of healthcare and professions across the United States? So again, I think 500 is a safe kind of recommendation to make. And like I said, there's room that it could come back lower, and I will take what I can get.
Jason, this is Jesus. So two things. One, I agree with Kat. I think that's a reasonable ask with the, with the expectation that maybe it will take a little back and forth discussion, but I think 500 is reasonable given the size of our board and the licensing population. I just had a question. I apologize. I think you said it, but I missed it. Relative to sort of all the other PT boards, relative to their fee caps, how close are they to those fee caps right now? Did you get a sense of that?
That I don't.
Just curious.
But I could tell you that I won't say that I know for certain that across the United States that the structure is similar enough that they even have fee caps, right? So like I did run across a couple states, Oregon being one of those states that has this kind of rolling invoice, right? So they have a minimum fee and then they have a fee based on their expenditures, right? So they'll collect whatever monies they spent and they'll disperse that amongst their licensing population, meaning that there's a section of their renewal fee that can go up or down based on the board's expenses, which I found, quite fascinating. So the idea of a statutory cap, I'm sure exists in a lot of different places throughout the United States, but I don't know their caps. I only know their actual fees at this point. The fees alone were very difficult to find. And one of the places we went to go look for their fees is their statutory language, right? Is their practice act, those kind of things. So we can go back and take a look to see if there are caps and if their fees are actually set in regulation at a lower rate, how close are they to being in caps or not. We didn't do that part of this kind of research round. This time around, we were just looking at what are they actually taking in as far as a revenue off of the licensing renewal currently. And even then, there's a lot to be open for interpretation because you have to consider population density, demographics, geographics, those kind of things. How many licensees does that particular state have? How many healthcare licensees does that particular state have? Because if they work under an umbrella agency, they have different costs. Does the board have autonomy or not? There's a lot of different factors in the way they establish their fees. But moving forward, we could look at, some of those, our closest Venuses, if you will, to see where they are in their statutory caps.
So, Tanya, Dale, anything to add?
No, I'm just agreeing with everybody's ideas, and thank you, Jason, for sharing how you came to share this information with us, your research. Makes sense.
I think that the 500 is reasonable, and we haven't increased often, so it gives us that little cushion for not doing a frequent increase. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which I think is more of a, it's just more of a flag. If we just do it in every few years, then I just feel like it's more reasonable.
Just a little context to add to that comment is that through the last couple fee increases, right, I can tell you just from kind of personal experience, the fee increase that we did in 2006, 7, 8, and 9, right, we went from 120 to 150. And so just a $30 increase, I think was almost too conservative of an approach, because after we did that fee increase, we also had a pretty big hit when it came to the economy in California. Things kind of slowed down around that period of time, and costs went up for the board as well. And so we got ourselves into kind of a really tight situation when it came to our fiscal situation, because our fund conditions started to dwindle. We were essentially spending more than we were bringing in revenue-wise. And we had a loan to the general fund that was substantial enough that it put a pretty big hit in the fund condition. That was ultimately repaid. But even by the time that loan was repaid, it didn't help our financial situation all that much. It just kind of put the inevitable off. Once we increased the revenues to 200, from 150 to 200, again, I think we should have went from 120 to 200. It was almost like this very measured step, but it was a little bit too conservative of an approach. To kind of echo, Dr. Armstrong's point, is we have been very frugal and prudent in our spending, and even in our approach of trying to increase revenues. So at this point, that's to our favor, right? There's one I'll tell you is increasing fees through regulation is an extremely difficult process to begin with. So if you're going to do it to have a lasting effect. Don't do it with the idea of coming back the very next year and having to go through the whole process over again. Luckily, I think for us, while we're asking for a statutory cap increase, I don't anticipate a fee increase of any kind for at least the next 2 years.
Thank you for explaining that. That's actually good background information to hear. I think the members have a unique perspective as being members. We get to hear things, explained to us different ways and understand them. To the licensees, if they see this or when they see this, proposal, of course, they're going to think, oh my goodness, they just want to, raise caps. And then the legislature, who, in my understanding, has allowed for a cap increase because something's on fire, not because we were looking ahead and getting that increase just in case. I think we're going to have to be very clever in our presentation so that the perception changes that this is a just in case, and provide all that great data that you've collected, you and staff have collected, and looking at our budget futures, what each month or when that would start to change or when we project a change. And I'm not sure, but possibly even selling that if sometime in the future we're looking good, we are also open to decreasing fees. So this isn't just, and you've mentioned that before.
Absolutely.
So this isn't, so that it's not just about a cap increase so that we're going to go there right away. I think that's what people need to hear so that their perspective changes, that we're not just doing this to get the money.
You know, it's a unique, I won't say unique, maybe I'll say it's a quirky kind of aspect of government structure that we don't really reward the idea of being proactive, right? That a lot of the things that we do are very reactive in nature when it comes to changing legislation. And so here we are kind of, doing a measure of what our anticipated revenues are going to be, and the ceilings that we're up against with the fee caps. And then to your point, having said that, should in the event our costs are diminished, if you will, and I'm hesitant to even talk in that direction because one of the things that we talk about is the advent of technology and automation and eliminating overhead and those kind of things, which I'm always looking at doing. And there's still plenty more to do. So any resources that I've freed up through automation and resources, automation and technology in the past got sucked up by a special project. Trust me, we're still trying to put multiple fires out in other areas. But there may come a time where that automation provides so much efficiency that our costs go down exponentially. And those revenues continue to come in, that your fund condition continues to grow. And the fund condition is essentially just the PT board savings account, if you will. Right now, we are just touching, for the first time, a double-digit fund condition, right? And that's where I'm comfortable at. I think that's a good rainy day fund. That's a good way to make sure that this board stays solvent during hard times or any kind of unanticipated change or unanticipated cost. But I have this kind of bucket list goal before I retire as a state worker to reduce fees at some point. I would like to be able to say that I did that during my tenure at this board. So we're always trying to kind of make those tweaks to, with that being kind of the ultimate goal. Normally, you reduce fees when your fund condition hits 24 months. When you have 24 months of operating costs, is when you should start looking at reducing the fees that you collect from your licensing population. So we've got a ways to go, but that doesn't mean that there might be some other fees that, could be reduced or eliminated if they're found to be unnecessary. So something we're always looking at.
This is Tanya. So technically what you're saying is every 2 years, there's the option to revisit this.
So there's the option to, as far as the legislative session, yes, right? So if it's not done in sunset, it's always something that we can pursue. Again, my experience has been that when statutory caps are extended, it's usually by necessity. It's not proactive planning or, saving for a rainy day kind of concept. It's more about this board is in financial dire straits and they need to have the statutory caps extended so that they can also increase fees simultaneously.
Well, when we present this to the legislature, we're going to have to sell it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're going to have to really give good data and a strong presentation for our ask. And I do think it can be done. So I am still in support of us pursuing this.
A number of the consultants that were involved in this in the last sunset are still consultants on the BNP. And so the seed was planted in the last sunset, right? They're still familiar. So us bringing it back as an issue is just consistent in the conversation. And our argument only becomes stronger increasingly over time. So I'm happy to have those conversations with the consultants.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think about as far as our costs are the costs that we cannot recoup that we are responsible for with disciplinary cases.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of those can be pretty lofty, and then in some, you add them up, and I mean, and so we just never know.
Sure.
Right?
Your enforcement program is designed through cost recovery to at least compensate itself for partial costs, or even commiserate costs is a better way to say it. You know, you can receive a complaint, pursue that complaint, and expend quite a bit of money on that particular complaint just to find out on the other end there's no violation or no fault, or the original allegation wasn't substantiated, but we found something, you know, there's something there. And so you can't ask that licensee to bear the weight of all those costs. But that's the design of the licensing population system and the renewal system, is that's what the $300 every 2 years is for, is to not just fund the administration of the board, but to fund the unexpended section of enforcement. So to the extent that we can pursue cost recovery, we will. But there are restrictions there. There's case law and precedent that says, you know, you really have to look at how much an investigation costs, and is that actually commiserate with the investigation and the charges? And even the ability of the licensee to pay those costs has to be a consideration. Mm-hmm. The rest that we can't collect ultimately is bared on the licensing population as a whole in those expenses. And I think we do a really good job in cost recovery. But you're right, some of those costs are ultimately bared as licensees as a whole as part of their renewal. We also, you know, over the last 3 or 4 years, well, longer than that now, 5 or 6 years, have always been able to revert part of our budget back into the fund at the end of every fiscal year, meaning that we are living within our means. And even living within our means and still accomplishing some really big things like relocating from a smaller space to a larger space, or essentially almost doubling in size when it comes to staff, right? We're still living within our means of what was budgeted for us. So I think that just goes to show, you know, there is a sense of responsibility fiscally there, and we can use that as kind of a leverage tool when we're discussing it with the legislature as well. So if there is a consensus, we'll move forward with that $500 number, and staff and I will try to build as much of a rationale to provide to the legislative staff as possible, and we'll also work with the committee in doing that.
It sounds like I've heard from members that there is a consensus, but if that's something that you're not comfortable with, or if you've got any other questions or concerns, can you unmute and say so now so we're all aware? Okay, sounds like we're okay. And so if it's all right, I think it's a good time to ask for some public comment now on this subject. So moderator, can you please facilitate public comment?
This is the moderator. I've opened up the Q&A feature. Members of the public, if you would like to participate, the instructions are on the screen for your reference. Click on that Q&A icon, which is a question mark inside a black square, typically located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. And in the text box, type, I would like to make a public comment, and make sure to send it to all panelists. And when prompted, click the Unmute Me button. So I'm going to pause now for a moment to allow members of the public time to access the Q&A feature. Board President, no requests have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on. The third recommendation that staff brought to the board as a new issue for sunset was the idea of adding WebEx language to our meeting statute, not to replace, but to be in addition to, or not to be in lieu of, but to be in addition to. and I thought at the October meeting that by the time we got to the November meeting, I might have some more information of what maybe the legislative plan is moving forward with that recent bill that was passed that extended our ability to meet like we are meeting today in WebEx. Unfortunately, we don't have anything new to report. And it's only been 2 weeks, but you know, it's getting close to that January deadline, and so we're a little anxious about that. But to go back to our original recommendation, you know, I think there have been a couple examples of late. You know, so what we're actually looking at is that the statutory language would read and require the board to not only meet in person in Southern California and Northern California, but to also have some kind of WebEx component to provide, you know, further access to the public and those that could not travel or would not be there otherwise. And it sounds like there, even today, some boards are returning back to in-person meetings. In fact, I think our council actually attended a meeting for the acupuncture board that was kind of this hybrid concept, where it was an in-person meeting, but they still provided the WebEx portion of it to increase access to the public, which sounds exactly kind of what we're looking for, creating as a requirement within our own PT Practice Act, hoping that, you know, we have that as a backup in case no further legislation is written to amend the Begler-Keene Act. And I don't know if Michael, if you'd want to address any of that, kind of how it went, or if you thought it was accessible.
Yeah, I was just going to add, actually, it was the California Architects Board that had that meeting. And it very much, in all respects, was an in-person meeting, except that whenever public comment was taken, there was an opportunity. I don't think we had any public in the room, but there was an opportunity for individuals who were present in the room at the in-person meeting to provide public comment, but that the WebEx platform was also utilized really solely for public comment, and there was some public comment that came in through WebEx. But you know, very briefly on the legal side, it would require an amendment to Bagley-Keene, or at least some sort of a reference to Bagley-Keene, because it would be exempting the teleconference rules there. And I would expect that at least there should be some resolution at some point. I certainly don't know how that will be resolved, but you know, all the other boards, of course, are having the same issue.
And I think for our upcoming meeting in December will be our first attempt at trying out that hybrid meeting, where we have board members in attendance, public attendance possibly at this location as well, and then also keeping that WebEx functionality for those that would like to attend remotely and provide comment from afar. So, and I think we did discuss at the last meeting that ultimately there's going to have to be something that comes from the legislature that addresses Bagley-Keene. But I think, you know, hopefully this is something that kind of spurs the conversation or encourages the conversation, if you will, at that level, because returning back to, you know, having been exposed to this kind of technology and this ease of access, all to be relegated back to this old, antiquated type of teleconference, which really the access isn't as it's not nearly as readily accessible as the WebEx is. And if that is the intent, is to create the increase of public contact, returning back to old Bagley-Keene is just the wrong way to do it. So. Are there any kind of questions or comments regarding pursuing that as an issue? Do we think it's worth pursuing as an issue? And then even, you know, given council's testimony about there has to be some kind of remedy being provided by the legislature when it comes to Bagley-Keene in the future. That being the case, is it something you think is worth carrying as a torch in sunset to amend in our own PC Practice Act?
I'm giggling
Yeah.
because, I mean, I'd like to see it addressed sooner than later. Not to say that the legislature wouldn't do it sooner, and maybe they will. Maybe we'll get started on this, and they will, and we'll decide in December to.
That would be my guess. With this most recent bill expiring at the end of January, keeping in mind while the sunset process is occurring now, and the hearings will occur in the first quarter of next year, the effective date of whatever sunrise bill comes from our successful sunset will not be effective until the following January 1st, right? So it may be work for naught.
Yeah.
If you look at just kind of the sequence of the way we're working versus the way potential solutions for that problem could be moving through the legislature. With that bill expiring January 31st, I would like to believe that the legislature has received enough, feedback from not just the Department of Consumer Affairs, but every other, agency inside of the state that's affected by Bagley Keene. This is creating an issue. And so that whatever solution will be provided in an emergent way. And so, statutes that are put into effect by the nature of emergency and are immediately effective, this could be a non-issue at that point.
So I'm wondering if staff can, without putting too much time and resources into this subject, can do a little background checking in with DCA and or legislature and just ask, is it on your, is it on your clock at all? Are you thinking about this? And then we would know whether or not to. Yeah,
we'd be happy to. We have plans to do anyway.
Okay.
It's something that, we'd like to have kind of an open dialogue conversation with staffers at the BMP. And we do take that as a kind of a time of opportunity to broach this as a topic each and every time we've spoken to them. What's going on with Bagley Keene? Do we think that there's any solace or remedy going to be provided anytime soon? We'll continue to do that.
Yeah, and DCA as well. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they've already got that ball rolling, maybe.
Yeah. We have a reoccurring legislative roundtable with the Department of Consumer Affairs, and this is always a topic that we address them.
Okay.
We have a very good relationship and rapport with the Deputy over Legislation, Jennifer Simoes, and so we're in constant contact with her as well. And I think I could say that probably for every board and bureau too. This is something that affects us all, and I'm sure that we're banging on their doors in every direction at that point. So DCA is very familiar with our strife. It's their strife as well. In fact, even the moderators that are on this call today, thank you very much for being here. I know you guys are short-staffed, and there's way too many board meetings for you to have to moderate and still continue your duties. That's solid, whether it be training, onboarding, and those kind of things. But the services that you provide for facilitation are priceless to the boards and bureaus.
Yeah. Other board member comments, questions about this topic?
Alicia, this is Jesus. Just a quick comment. I am in favor of sort of pursuing this language change. I think that some of the pushback might be just the perception that this is going to be the surrogate for in-person meeting, and it's really not intended to be that. I think all boards are, looking forward to our in-person resumption of in-person meeting. But I see this as just an extension of access. Having been part of quite a few teleconferences, this is a much better platform to allow public participation. And I think that needs to be part of the message, is that, this type of platform is not in lieu of in-person. It's just an opportunity to extend access and participation.
to Dr. Dominguez's comments, I'm concerned about that as well. That there is this kind of perception that this could be a replacement for instead of in addition to. I also think that so some of the boards have expressed that WebEx has provided a great deal of cost savings to those boards. And I don't want to negate that in any way. There has been a huge cost savings for us as well. But we have an obligation to the public, and we have an obligation to our licensees, and we have a mandate of being accessible. And I think there's no better way to be accessible than to be face-to-face and provide that level of access to our public. At the same time, creating another door for those that don't have an opportunity to travel to a location but can provide, comment and feedback remotely in addition to that is just that. It's just a value add. There's no takeaway from. There's another portion of this that I don't think we've touched on too much, and that's just that would allow the board to be even more flexible. So I guess the scenario I see playing out at that point is in our PT Practice Act, we have an obligation to have a board meeting in Northern California once a year and have a board meeting in Southern California once a year. And 3 total. That's the obligation. We typically do our 4, and we typically travel. But imagine a situation where we're supposed to be in Southern California in March of this upcoming year, and maybe only 4 out of the 7 board members can actually attend the meeting physically in Southern California. There's something that's come up. There's some issue, whether it be scheduling or otherwise, where 3 members can't attend physically. I could see a scenario where they attend remotely, right? And so you might have 4 board members in the room and 3 remote. And if Bagley Keene is amended to kind of keep this language as we see now, that could work, right? You would still have that public venue for people to come to in that Southern California location. And you would have 4 members present. So you have that representation of the board. You have 3 members present remotely, but you also have a pretty significant portion of the public present remotely as well, or at least providing access to them. And if we go back to the old Bagley Keene, if a board member can't be there, they just can't be there. And this, I think, allows for much greater flexibility in that. And while that provided flexibility for access to the members and members to be able to attend, that in and of itself is a cost savings. Those 3 members that may not have been able to physically make it to the Southern California meeting are still there, minus the costs of their travel, minus their cost of them actually being there. So something just to keep in mind. I think it's the flexibility it provides for me, again, it's just commonsensical.
Other member comments, questions?
I also I agree with everything and pursuing this. I also believe that we may have more PT student participation if they can log on remotely, so not just public participation, but also PT program and student participation. Because they wouldn't have the time to, or they could come to part of the meeting and it would educate them on the business of the board and what we do.
That's a great point. When we're calendaring meetings and we're trying to schedule, and I'm kind of going back to when we were doing physical meetings, we almost always have a traveling board meeting at an educational program, at a DPT school or a PTA school. And we try to work with those schools and their schedules to make it so that their students can, one, attend, but it's beneficial for them to attend depending on what part of the program they're in, right? They're coming close to licensure or they're just starting. And even to the extent that before COVID-19, we tried to kind of do this pilot program of an hour-long Q&A where students could, address the board directly and kind of get as educated as possible, real time. And it worked really well, but we were only able to do it, once or twice before the nation shut down. So when we returned to that, just to kind of echo Dr. Armstrong's comments, we did have, logistically, sometimes it was difficult. I think Dr. Dominguez will kind of speak to that too. There were times, even during COVID, where we were able to meet with students from USC, but the cohort itself was split in half, and so only half the cohort could come in person, and the other half of the cohort had to attend remotely. And this would just be, an example of how that might play out at a board meeting as well.
And to your point, Jason, this is Jesus. To your point, having this kind of platform opens it up to other programs, students in other programs where we've been limited usually to when we've had board meetings at DPT academic programs, it's really been the student body and their availability there. But with everybody's curricular schedule differing, we might actually have more student participation this way from other, across the board from other programs.
I know our communication and education analyst, April Beauchamp, is listening in. And I know she's just, seeing this as more students than just the school we're presenting at, and just seeing that as an opportunity. So yeah, it might take a little canoodling, a little scheduling, a little arm twisting to get it done, but it's absolutely something that we would see as being beneficial.
Any comments from Ms. Ellaby or Ms. McMillian?
This is Katerina. Yes, I believe it's worth pursuing, and it might become duplicative once we find out that DCA is already working on this. But, our mandate is public protection, so I would like to take that responsibility on for our licensees and for the public. And then, if we find out that somebody else is already working on it, then that's even better.
Yep. This is Tanya, and I too would like to pursue this. I think the more options that we give to the public to participate or just tune in, the better for us and for them. So that's my feeling.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing that. Very well said. And so I think, Mr. Kaiser, you've got support from the members to pursue this. And it's probably a good time to ask for public comment again. So I'll ask the moderator to please facilitate public comment.
The moderator, I've opened up the Q&A. Members of the public, if you would like to participate, the instructions are on the screen for your reference. You can click on the Q&A icon, typically located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. It is a question mark inside a square. Once you open that, a text box will appear in which you can type in, "I would like to make a public comment," and you send to all panelists. When prompted, click the Unmute Me button. So I'm going to pause now a moment to allow members of the public time to access the Q&A feature. No requests have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam President, quick question. How possible would it be, possibly using our social media to do a quick survey asking a question pertaining to this possibility? Or is that even legal?
So just querying stakeholders over the idea of, would you like to see us add WebEx functionality to all of our meetings?
Yes.
That's totally possible. Look for it next week.
Okay.
Awesome. Let me know if I can help. Happy to help. Okay. All right. Anything else, Jason?
That was all for the homework assignments, essentially, from the last meeting. Maybe like a small bio break so we can queue up switching over to the report itself.
Yeah.
And we come back. Brooke will be driving the document, and we can go through and see what members have to contribute based on the latest draft. I think that'll give us about 30 minutes worth of work before we have to recess for closed session.
Okay, and so our intentions are to have a roll call, make sure members are all back by, let's say, 10:35? 10:35?
That'll work.
All right.
Recording is in progress.
Okay, we're going to start by doing a roll call to make sure we're all here.
Alicia Benjamin,
I am here.
Dale Armstrong,
Present.
Jesus Dominguez,
Present.
Daniel Drummer. Daniel Drummer is absent. Katarina Ellaby,
Present.
Jonathan Urban. Jonathan Urban is absent. Tanya McMillian.
Present.
All members are present with the exception of Dr. Drummer and Jonathan Urban, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you so much. So are we actually now on agenda item number 5?
We are now on agenda number 5.
Thank you for helping me with that. Okay, so turn it over to you.
Okay. If the moderator would make Brooke Arneson the presenter, we're going to share her screen.
The moderator, I've passed the presenter role to Brooke. Thank you.
Once we get Brooke's screen up, what we're going to do is she will be displaying the preview or the latest draft that we sent to members yesterday. But if members have any comments from the previous draft, please continue to share those with us. This latest draft is an extended work with additions of staff additions, but also with additions based on the committee with both Tanya McMillian and Jesus Dominguez. So, going through this, it's much easier when we're in person. All right, and so we're going to hit a couple speed bumps, I'm sure. But without the fine-tooth comb of going through this kind of page by page, we do want to try to do it as sequentially as possible. So if there's any feedback or commentary by board members, just come on the mic and shout it out, and we'll try to scroll through these sections. And there are a couple of sections that I'm going to highlight. I don't know that we're going to get to them before the 11 o'clock closed session break, but when we return from it, there's definitely a part of the new item, the new questions in the latest agenda template for 2138 language that I want to highlight for the board. But until then, we'll just start with section 1, which is background and description of the board and regulated profession.
Okay. And in addition to board members chiming in, I think for me anyway, it would be helpful as if we go through each section, if you can maybe even, or any staff can just highlight, obviously it's very similar to the last time, this is what was taken out or this is what was added. I don't expect you to be in depth about it, but maybe just give us an overview.
So for background, as we discussed previously, the board put a lot of investment and time into the 2016 sunset report. So the history of the board is very much cut and paste from that. And then we're going to kind of continue off of that. There is some, and Dr. Dominguez and Ms. McMillian were very helpful when it came to the committee looking at through some of that where it's cut and paste doesn't always work. Sometimes things have changed and the context around them have changed, and so we're going to have to make some edits there. But so for this one, it is just purely historical accounting of the board and some of its major accomplishments over the last couple of years or any changes to its practice act. Brooke, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, the history and function of the board is pretty much similar to the 2016. I don't think we added anything in addition for these sections right here that we're seeing on the screen. This is just copy and pasted from prior.
And from the members' review, is there anything to highlight, feedback, anything that you want added about this particular section? It is probably one of the most run-of-the-mill parts of the report, but okay. I believe in section 1 it's still the legislation regulation.
Correct. We go from profession of physical therapy to occupations. From there, we went into the board committees.
So for the board committees, we did want to make kind of a note that there were a couple in the last draft that we didn't account for, such as Dr. Dominguez's participation on the education committee for FSBPT, and Dr. Alicia Rubina Amen's participation on the task force for foreign trained. So we're going to be making those changes as well. In fact, Brooke may have already incorporated them.
I don't think they're in here. We have them, they are shown. I don't want to scroll too fast, but at the end there's a section where we show all of our FSBPT attendance, and we did incorporate both of those committees in that chart.
Okay.
So attendance, we still have to input here. We do have the board member roster, which has been updated. And of course, PD&E will go in and make this look a lot nicer once we, give them the full report. Let me know if I'm going too fast. But further down in section 1, we talk about the board having a quorum at all of our meetings. One additional change is Liz and I have been working on the reorg, change in leadership, relocation. So this is kind of more of a concept. We're still fine-tuning the narrative. This is just kind of a real broad statement of what we're going to fine-tune. Strategic planning, we did add to update that we had our 2018 strategic plan, and that we're looking at revisiting our strategic plan no later than 2022.
Are we going to add anything, or is it even necessary regarding progress on our strategic plan?
Yeah, we will go through as part of the sunset and kind of handpick the goals and achievements that we've already obtained, and even kind of highlighting some of the ones that we're still working on, with the idea of, there might be an opportunity there for, if those things are rather difficult in nature, that the legislature might be able to provide some kind of assistance. So we will take the opportunity to do that in that section.
Okay, it'll happen in this section here?
Correct.
Thank you.
It might also occur elsewhere throughout the report, because a lot of the things that we do, we try to reinforce by saying as part of the board's strategic plan. So
Nice.
it should all have this kind of very circle effect.
And then, of course, we're moving on into the legislative action. So we're going over all of the statutes from 2021 to I believe it goes back through 2018. There's quite a few bills. Every bill that we've been watching and with a bill of interest has been, and with chapter, is incorporated here. I'm going to go through that. There's quite a few of them, so I'm just going to scroll down. So it's just basically giving this bill number, the subject matter, the sections affected, effective date, and the summary of what that law does.
What does this tell the the committee, the joint committee, this information?
So I think it's kind of twofold. One is we're also going to highlight where the board actually took action in particular pieces of legislation, right? Where we offered a letter of support or a letter of opposition. But one of the things, and it's been kind of conversation with members in the past, is our staff provides to the members a fairly lengthy legislative report. And sometimes there's a cloud of what the expectation is for you as members. We're bringing it to your attention. We've identified that this has some kind of effect on either the PT profession or the administration of the PT profession. And so we're bringing it to your attention. As members, if there's anything about this particular legislation that you want to escalate to a position of either support or oppose, that's the prerogative of the board. So we do bring to you more than, you are going to take action on. Because there are some things that they have slight changes and they will have an effect on us. But whether, how we feel about it as a board, as members, how you feel about it as a board might be completely neutral. And it might have little to no effect. So we are identifying it. And one of the things that I like about that when it comes to the committee is how cognizant we are of legislative change.
Yeah.
Right? So we are paying attention. We are looking for things. And I will tell you, as disciplined as we are in looking for it, with just, staff assistance, and then even with DCA's legislative staff assistance, there are still times where legislation that affects us gets completely past us, even to the point where it's, reached the governor's desk and hit signature and a law has been implemented, and we have no idea that it had any effect on physical therapy. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Sometimes things don't clearly say physical therapy. Sometimes a bill is clearly just healthcare or Division II or something like that. And so we have had a couple of those in the last legislative session where we thought, wow, how did that even get past our radar, right? Well, it didn't just get past our radar, it got past everybody's radar, and it was because of the way it was written. So I think if you think about the legislation that was crafted that was intended to affect or assist contract workers like Uber or Lyft, that's a good section of legislation where it wasn't very clear how it was going to affect all contract workers, right? So I think for us in this report, it's important to include all of the different bills that we've ever brought to you, that you've ever had, your position wasn't necessarily opposed or support, it was neutral, or just watch. We're just going to sit back. We're just recognizing that it would have some kind of effect.
Okay, so this is saying, pointing out to Joint Committee, these are the bills we've kept our eyes on. These are the bills that we've actually taken action on.
Right, and we'll do one of two ways. Is right now we have them kind of sequential in the way that they were presented, and there's only, I believe, 3 or 4 over the last 5 years that the board even offered a letter of support.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's even past the legislative point, and the letter was being sent to the governor for signature, or approval of signature. But we're playing with how we're going to call those out. And we're going to do it one of a couple different ways. And whichever way is kind of the most or least innocuous is what we'll choose. We'll bring it back for you as board members to choose. But so you could have all the list, and at the very end, here are the 3 or 4. And you could categorize them in letter of support, letter of opposition, or leave them peppered in and just call them out a different way. And it just depends on how well it reads, So we'll provide it as an option both ways.
So at least the committee members are looking at these bills that we've been watching, saying, "Oh, this is what's important to this board. This is what the board looks for." Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Any other board member comment or question on that?
Okay, next in this section is similar to legislation, is the regulatory action. So this is just any regulatory changes that were approved by the board. So language that has been approved. So we've got the subject matter of the sections affected, the effective date. For example, a lot of them say this proposed regulatory language is currently in process, and then a summary of what it does, each regulatory package does. So we have all of our regulatory packages listed.
So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
this is Jesus. I just had a quick question. Is it important to sort of frame the in process? Would that be helpful to the legislature? I just ask. So in other words, how far along?
Oh, specify exactly where it is in the process, for example.
Just a question, not suggesting anything. Just I'm curious if that would be something that the legislature would want to know beyond, okay, they're working on it. It's in process. I mean, not just to you, Brooke, just to everybody. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's important to call it out. And so effective date is very simple once the regulation has been approved and gone into effect. We don't have examples of that. So we have almost everything's in process. The one that should be effective, I think, is
this one right here, the substantial
relationship and criteria. We can actually post the dates that those went into effect because they went into effect recently. But I think if you wanted to add context to it, you could say when the package was started as well.
Would it be too much? Would it take up too much room? Would it be too much information to add in the graphic of the arrows, the dated arrows that we see in our board member agenda materials or the agenda materials?
Or something like that?
Something that paints the picture, I think.
Yeah, we can come up with a concept, because one is I don't want to make the report too lengthy. And while there's only 5 packages here, I think a visual of some kind to show the kind of the history of the process of that particular reg is important.
I do want to get other board member input because, I mean, this is just my question, and thank you for asking the initial question, Jesus. But I do want to respect other board members' opinions as well if they don't feel like this should be included. But I do have another question, and that is, do we know how many reg actions we had between the last 2 sunsets? I mean, I'm seeing 5, and I'm just kind of shocked that it's 5, but I don't remember what we had last time.
In between 2012 and 2015?
Correct.
It was about the same.
Okay.
It's less than half. It's usually, typically, in my experience, we've had 1 or 2 reg packages a year.
Yeah, okay.
The difference being now is where it took anywhere from 12 to 16 months for a reg package start to finish and be done. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said, in trying to kind of administer the regulatory program, I didn't want to enter into too many packages because trying to deal with, more than 1 or 2 packages at a time can be very difficult. That's how we did it before. And so we were able to get, 5 or 6 done within a sunset period. Now, I tried and held off for quite a while where we had 1 or 2 packages pending, but we also had the whole 2138 controversy and an emergent need for that regulation to be crafted. So we added that to the pipeline of regs. And then we had a couple that we thought wouldn't be a real resource draw that we would just work on while we were kind of waiting for the high priority regs to go through the process of approval. And now we have 5 in the process in the hopper at one time. That's the most that I'm comfortable with crafting a single incident is 5 regulations. So I'm hoping the 2138, now being done and complete, and hopefully the model guidelines being completed very soon. I think the performance evaluation tool and also the coursework tool regulation should move that much more quickly through the process now that the kind of 2 behemoth packages are out of the way. And then we'll look at addressing some of the ones that we've been putting off for a while, polishing and fixing retirement, and then looking at continuing competency as well before we take on kind of the bigger task of just doing an assessment of what regulatory changes we need for like the application process and that kind of thing.
I'd like to hear from board members. Any comments or questions?
Alicia, this is Jesus. No question, just a comment. I have the 2016 report open on my desktop, and there were 5 regs at that time.
Thank you.
We've adopted the rule of 5s.
Well, there's something, there's too little regulation is bad and too much regulation is bad. If an entity is promulgating regulation that's not based on need or necessity, that's something to look at also, right? So the regs that we did prior to this sunset period were things like notice to consumer, changing the PT of record regulation, and even the supervisory recommendation for documentation. Those things were born from necessity. They were deemed being necessary. So 5 regs, it's a hard number to tell. Is that enough or is it too much? It's a case by case. You just have to look at it situationally.
Thank you for the context, and thank you for looking that up. Jesus, I think while I'm not eager to crank out regs, I do want our board to be able to do the work that we should be able to do in a timely manner. And so that would be my concern is, were we holding back, or are we holding back because we can't get things through in a timely manner? Katerina, any comments from you at all or questions?
No, I'm just kind of taking it all in. I haven't really formulated an opinion on this one yet.
This is Tanya. If I can chime in, Alicia, on your comment about the last 2 years and regs, but would that information be accurate, seeing how we went through a pandemic and things are completely different? So I feel like that would not be a basis for us to be accurate. Am I making sense?
Yes, you are, and I think it's a good question. Pre-pandemic, and Jason, you can speak about this much better than I can. There was a new reg unit formed, and the purpose of the new reg unit was, to be more efficient. But from the get-go, there were some challenges, and we just haven't seen it happen. And I'm not sure the pandemic had anything to do with it or not, but Jason, maybe you know a little more.
Well, the pandemic has certainly, complicated just about anything and everything we do, right? I mean, whether it's just a constant flow of communication that's disrupted by the pandemic because 3/4 of the state workforce is teleworking, right? That is a factor to consider. And the president brings up a good point with the creation of the new reg unit. There is a transition period that I think we expected in, hiring of new attorneys and getting them trained, onboarded, and familiar with each board's materials and proposed regs. I think we're past that. I think we've seen a lot of progress happen, but to Tanya's point, I do think that some of the higher level approvals have been delayed because of things like COVID and prioritization. So our regs that you see here, the 5 packages, with the exception of I think the retired license, almost everything is complete in the sense that staff is done with their work, right? We've created a polished product, we presented it and moved forward, and we're just waiting for an approval. In some instances, just to make it public and start that part of the process. But that approval process isn't just at the Department of Consumer Affairs, it's also at agency, the Bureau of Consumer Services and Housing Agency. And I'm sure that their resources are drawn thin when it comes to things like COVID-19 and the homeless population and how they are addressing vaccinations. So we have been knocked down a little bit in prioritization. There's just no way to avoid that conversation. having said that, as the administrator, I don't believe any of the packages are hindering our ability to do our day-to-days, right? So the model guidelines are just that, they're model guidelines. And so some of the language changes that are in the model guidelines or proposed in regulation are things that we've been typically using over the last 2 or 3 years, and now we're proposing using them as kind of common base language in the guidelines themselves. The performance evaluation tool we took on as a pilot program for foreign trained applicants to have that performance evaluation tool used on a volunteer basis as opposed to the performance instrument. And we still have some of that participation, so we're encouraged by its performance. Coursework Tool 6, we still take Coursework Tool 6, and that affects a very small section of the licensing population because most of our Coursework Tool 6s are still 1 through 5. So again, just those as a couple of examples. I don't think that our reg packages kind of hinder the day-to-day work, but at the same time, we would definitely like to see, progress moving forward, get some of these things completed. That way we could free up our own staff resources to tackle some ideas and things that staff have been, looking forward to moving on to for a very long time.
Thank you. Any other follow-up comments or questions? The subcommittee can decide what we might want to add or not add, and if something's added, we'll bring it to the board at the December meeting and make a decision whether we want to keep it or add.
Yeah, certainly staff and I will be working with them to kind of look at that presentation along with the legislative language to figure out, which is the most appealing way to present it to the legislature.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Right at 11.
Oh, we are right at 11. Okay, so we'll just pick this back up where we are, Brooke. You'll make a note of that. We'll pick this back up at 1 o'clock. And so now we'll go into closed session and then recess for lunch from 12 to 1. So we will not open back into open session until 1 p.m. So do we need a little time to go into closed session? Jason, like 5 minutes or so?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. It is 1:01 p.m. and if we could please have roll call.
Alicia Benina here. Dale Armstrong.
Here.
Jesus Dominguez.
Present.
Daniel Drummer. Daniel Drummer is absent. Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian. Tanya McMillian is absent as well. All members are present with the exception of Daniel Drummer, Jonathan Irvin, and Tanya McMillian, and the board has a quorum.
Thank you very much. And so before we let you pick back up, Brooke, where you left off, if staff wants to give members and our audience an idea of the rest of the afternoon, how that's going to go, maybe?
Sure. We're going to address issue item number 5 on the agenda. We're going to pick up where we just left off prior to closed session. And moving forward through the afternoon, as much as members can spare time, we will take and review the documentation. So what you have before you is just, again, a rough draft that has been, we've only had 2 meetings now with the Sunset Committee comprised of Dr. Dominguez and Ms. McMillian, who did have to step away for the rest of the afternoon. And I'm not sure, but I believe Dr. Dominguez's time might be in short supply. No, he's shaking his head no. So
I am here, sir. Cleared my schedule. Ready to go.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Not at all.
If the monitor can again make Brooke Arneson a host so she could share her screen.
This is the moderator. I've passed the presenter role. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, picking up where we left off. Again, what you'll see here is starting with describing major studies conducted by the board. What you see in blue is, again, kind of cut and paste repeated language from a prior 2016 meeting. Most of it is still very pertinent. If there's any kind of comments or questions from the members as we move through these, please, just unmute your mic and speak up. We have standing meetings weekly now, set and scheduled, with the two-member committee to kind of work with staff. And the idea is staff can continue to add their additions to the report, send those reports out so that the committee members have the weekend prior to kind of review them, go through them, make any kind of edits or recommendations. Some of that can be provided back to us through email or electronic communication, but ultimately to be discussed at the following Tuesday. And then, once that's done, we'll take those edits and recommendations that were given that Tuesday, work on them as well as the rest of the way of the condition of the report until the following Friday, so on and so forth, until we get to the December meeting. Any questions about the methodology?
Why do you think they are asking this question? Is this something that's expected of boards to do, and what type of research would they necessarily be looking for?
So keep in mind the template is written in a very broad way to address all the different boards and bureaus.
Yes.
And so that addresses all of the obligations of boards and bureaus as well. And some boards statutorily have these kind of obligations. We don't. So what we have here is cut and paste from 2016. It was the only thing during that period of time that kind of fit into this category. So the issue that is found here that has to do with the in-house consultant, we've considered it to be resolved. We reported it to the legislature in 2016. It is a remnant left over from an audit. We've resolved that audit as well. So this is one where, while it's here for kind of a placeholder of what was in the previous report, I don't project it going forward.
Okay.
We would take it out. And essentially, to answer that question is we don't have any of those kind of studies to present.
And the committee knows and realizes that that's just not in our Practice Act or
just categorically, there's nothing that fits for PTDC in that category.
But there's no expectation from them?
I don't believe there's an expectation for them. I think it's just a broad way for them to make sure the report fits all of the different, boards or bureaus that are being reviewed during sunset.
Okay. Thank you.
Jason and Alicia, to that point, so in my mind, the word major, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to frame here. So, for example, Jason, when the board requests information like just a survey of the fee cap and those kinds of things, which sort of indicates that the board is sort of vigilant, right? We're not just sitting back waiting for things to happen in a reactionary manner, but we're trying to anticipate things. In my mind, I may be wrong, but in my mind, that doesn't rise to a major study, right? We're talking more about these kinds of studies that you have under D right now, where there were various stakeholders involved in discussions and those kinds of things. Correct? So.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. So in the past, things that would have qualified, as an example, would be the Continuing Competency Task Force. Something where a major study was conducted and helped promulgate regulation, or the Supervisory Task Force, or as like the example that's here, and some of you as members are familiar with, we had a wellness symposium where we had comprised a panel, brought in stakeholders, and talked about a topic very specifically, looking at any kind of changes that needed to be made. So yeah, major really does kind of play into that, where at any given board meeting, you know, the board can instruct staff to research something that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a major study.
Could I just ask one follow-up? I'm sorry, Jason. So the animal rehab issue, is that something that would have potentially appeared here, or is that something that was resolved? I have to pull up the 2016 sunset to see if it was mentioned there or not. Because
it wasn't, and in part because of the way that that particular task force was comprised. I, representing the Physical Therapy Board, wasn't actually a member of the task force. I was a source to be relied upon and just almost kind of in a guest kind of role. If I was actually listed as a task force member, I would have included it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jason.
So then we can look at representation outside of the board, either through professional organizations such as CPTA or FSBPT. And again, some of these things have not changed. The answers to the questions today are the same as they were in 2016. We will have to go through some of the attendance things, where we participated, who participated, what panels, so on and so forth. But we've made those changes as we think meet the last 5-year period. So take a look at that and make sure if there's anything that you think is missing, please just let us know. And we'll make those edits to the report too. This isn't the last time we're going to be, as a staff, fact checking this particular chart either. When we go about doing the attendance report, we're going to take those two at the same time just to make sure that we provide the correct information. Just a kind of point of context for that particular chart. I think it's a direct reflection on the board itself, right? Almost every board member has served and has had some kind of role on that list. Whether you're a delegate with FSBPT or an alternate, or provided a contribution on one of their task forces or work projects or something like that, every member of this board has served a role in that in some way, shape, or form. So I love that going into sunset, and have a very engaged membership. So section 2 is a little bit different for us this year because we're going to take a different twist on the questions being asked. We are going to provide all of the same context that we provided in years past when it comes to surveys of our stakeholders as they pertain to consumers about the complaint process, or applicants about the application process, or licensees about just general, customer service about transactions, renewals, name changes, those kind of things, or even just their engagement with the board. But we're also going to take this opportunity to insert data that we've received for surveys from our school presentations and our outreach. We're still kind of deciding how much of it we want to provide in context, what's the best delivery to the stakeholder group at the legislature. What we provided here is just about every data element we could when it comes to the survey itself, but we will kind of taper it down a little bit. One of the reasons for that is we have so much data when it comes to the outreach side of things about survey results, as opposed to the other types of surveys, which by priority really should be more important. So I don't want to have one kind of survey group outshine the others. We did come up with a fourth survey group, and that is FSBPT does provide us with a survey system at the Prometric Center site as it pertains to the national exam and the California law exam. And so we're going to figure out a way to incorporate those into this section of the report as well.
So is the green column number of responses?
So for that particular fiscal year, we received 11 responses from the students at Cal State University, Sacramento.
And then under number 2, what does the green column represent there?
Scroll down for me.
Number 2.
Number 2 is, okay. So number 2 is blank data presentation.
Oh.
I think we're just taking all of the questions and trying to kind of put a whole listing of all the questions. That's not really necessarily a question that statistically provides any relevance. So, and then name of presenters, I believe is the number of attempts or number of times presentations have been given. Is that right?
It's the number of times, so like if your name was mentioned as the presenter 61 times, it was mentioned. Sarah was 10 times, you're at 126, and then mine 97.
That's fine. Then we go through, some of these categories. Again, for the purpose of the Sunset Report itself, I don't know that we'll include all of this, but we'll include what we think is relevant given the audience of the report. And I don't know that we'll give it in this table format or something similar, like to a general satisfaction percentage versus, each and every question. So for the survey section, before we move on past that, the content that we don't have here for you yet is some of the results for the other types of surveys when it comes to the enforcement survey for consumer complaints. That will be providing to the committee members over the next week or two. And then discussion still has to be had with the committee members if there's maybe a cutoff point, if you will, where maybe after the next 2 or 3 Tuesday meetings that they want to finalize a draft and send that draft out to the members for any kind of comment to come back to the committee in consideration before the December meeting. So that's still to be determined. Okay. So fiscal and staff, this is one that is probably going to require the greatest amount of tweaking from the 2016 report. So everything that you see in here is kind of very, very draft, is very, very conceptual at this point. Some of it is just cut and paste from the last report as a placeholder. So, kind of keep that in mind when you're reviewing it. But if you do have any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to share, please do. Liz is on the line with us. But she did want me to stress that by no means is this anywhere close to being a polished product. It is definitely still in its draft form.
Is table 2 up to date?
Let's go down to that. So I believe table 2 is up to date with the best information that we have today. So not to say that it can't change a little bit moving forward, but based on the fund conditions that we've received over the last couple of fiscal years, they're represented here. But as you can see, fiscal year, this year we have that double-digit reserve that we talked about earlier in the meeting. And based on conservative projections moving forward, you start to see that fund conditions start to diminish over time. So fiscal year 21, 22, it starts to go down. And then again, a little bit more 22, 23. And we talked about this, I think, at length. Those projections are based on real expenditures, but projected revenues. And we never project revenues anything other than conservative. So we baseline our projections for revenues. If we received $6 million in revenues this year. We're going to use that $6 million as a projection moving forward, even if we know there's a increase in the population that will increase revenues, or an increase of applications received that will increase revenues. Because we can never confirm that that's going to happen, we're going to always, projections are always going to be very conservative.
Will we be building out into another fiscal year on this table for sunset purposes, or are we just going to go into 22, 23?
I believe it's just 22, 23.
Yeah. I mean, this is a nice part of that picture to paint for our ask.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, and again, it's a nice picture to paint, but always, being as genuine as possible. Those are conservative revenue projections.
Right.
It's certain to say that we're going to have a larger licensing population 2 years from now than we have now. But it's hard to estimate just how large, right? Because you have attrition, you have people leaving the profession at the same time they're entering, retirements, cancellations, licenses going delinquent status as they move from one state to another. So I appreciate the conservative estimate anyway, but just acknowledging kind of the elephant in the room. Yeah, I can't guarantee we're going to be at 7.3 and that there starts to be dire straits. But I also can't guarantee there's not, which is a reason to have the caps increased.
Yeah. So we'll pause and see if there's any comment from board members.
The only thing before I leave table 2 is you'll see in this next upcoming fiscal year, 21-22, is that there was a loan to the general fund, much smaller than the loans that we've been subject to in the past. But just keeping that in mind, that's still a pretty good chunk of change. Moving forward, the only way that we would anticipate getting those monies back is if we run into a reason to have them. If there's an insolvency issue or striving of funds, we're running a little thin, that might force the repayment. Till then, we wouldn't get it back unless the state finds itself in such a fiscal means that it could pay it back and didn't have any reason to not hold on to it. Which, the state of affairs in California, we are hearing that there has been a pretty significant surplus over the last couple of fiscal years, so that's a good possibility as well. Okay, let's slow down a little bit. Table 3. So this has been updated up to this year's data. This is expenditures by program component, so it's not necessarily something that we would use in projections anyway. We do it internally to try and establish fund conditions. We try to anticipate expenditures in the next fiscal year +1, fiscal year +2. And those, we do have some formulas that we use about what we would establish as baseline cost increases, cost of living, overhead costs that we know change from anywhere from 2 to 5% annually without waiver. We know that they're going to happen. And so you'll see in 2021, the anticipated cost has increased significantly, since the beginning of that period measured. So going from, 2.2 million to 2.9 million is a pretty significant cost. Again, this year for the sunset template, Breeze is still a hot button topic. There are still members of the legislature that want to know detailed information about the cost of Breeze and its effectiveness. So this table is used to address the cost, and as you've seen over the years, our annual costs for Breeze have trended down. The initial startup costs were that very beginning before Breeze was into effect, starting with that initial $40,000 contribution. Breeze goes into effect in 2016, and then you'll see as 2016 moves to today, we've had a significant decrease in cost because now it's not about startup costs, it's more about maintenance, and it will continue to do that for the next couple of years.
Jason, sorry, quick question. So is there an end date to our cost obligation here? Or will there always be a maintenance cost associated with Breeze?
Yeah, theoretically there is an end date, but there always will be that minimum maintenance cost involved. When I say theoretically, the end would be there's no major changes to the system to be made. It runs efficiently. We're not asking for any kind of product changes or anything like that. Even then, there will still be some server maintenance costs, troubleshooting costs with IT staff at the Department of Consumer Affairs and their OIS unit. How much that would be is based solely on the number of transactions that this board uses through Breeze and a combination of how many staff this board has as well. So will I see 177 go down? I think we will. I don't know that we're ever going to go under 100,000. I think we're always going to have this kind of maintenance cost for troubleshooting some of those issues. Any other questions from, especially as it pertains to Breeze? No questions of curiosity or anything like that? Breeze is still doing very well for us. We're still a proponent of Breeze, but you've probably heard me say it in the past. While we are happy with release 2 of Breeze, and like I said, works well for us, it doesn't necessarily mean that we might not jump ship and go to a better product sometime in the future if, through that kind of cost-benefit analysis process, it's reasonable and prudent to do it. Again, I just don't want to get caught behind the 8 ball when it comes to technology. I'd like to be ahead of that curve. So, the next section describes renewal cycles and the histories of our fees as we've gone through them. And again, we haven't had any fee changes since the last sunset. So I think that just kind of contributes to our argument in establishing the greater cap. As more time goes on, there's a higher probability that a fee increase will be needed at some point. Looking at Schedule 2, scroll to Table 4, just the fee schedule itself. So these are all of the different types of fees that we collect categorically, and the revenues represented through the fiscal years. Any questions in that area? No?
No, but I'm just wondering, would there be any anticipated questions in this area if we are asking to increase our cap? Could we anticipate any questions from the Joint Committee at all?
One of the questions that I would anticipate from the committee is the use of the ENMG and the KEMG certifications, because there has been no exercising of that over the last 3 fiscal years. And so I think there's going to have to be some explanation provided to the BNP staff as to why, have you not had any applicants and why do we think that that's the case?
Yeah.
And we'll be prepared in that conversation. We've had that conversation with staffers in the past.
Okay. Thanks.
The next section is it's going to be a larger section this year than it was in the last sunset, because essentially this is the place where we're going to record every budget change proposal that has occurred since the previous sunset. And since we've had some pretty significant growth and asked for monies to be redistributed as a result of that, every fiscal year will have the explanation for that budget change proposal provided. So can can I see the table itself? Yeah. So some of this table has been filled out, and these are, as an example, the second row of that particular table is the budget change proposal that created the staff services manager 2, or what you guys know as the assistant executive officer, right? So every line here represents the addition of a position at the board.
Five.
So, but keep in mind, a couple of those are more than one authority. So let's look at, go up a little bit.
Down?
Yeah, down. Five. Yeah. And without having Liz here on the line, I don't know if she's going to chime in. I think that's complete. I don't know if there are any missing. There are a few, for board's sake, this doesn't include limited term positions, right? These are actual permanent positions. And oftentimes as a practice for PTDC is we will establish a position as a limited term, quantify the workload to see if it's an ongoing workload or if it can be met on a temporary basis. More often than not, we determine that, yeah, it is an ongoing workload, and we'll try what we can to take that limited term position and create it as permanent. So some of the narrative here is up to date, but this is that conceptual language that we're talking about. So taking and picking up off of from the 2016 sunset, these are the steps that we've taken since.
So I see at the bottom of the narrative, there's, talks about the exempt level increase.
Yes. And we may have to put in a little bit more detail than that right there. That's essentially the description in a nutshell.
Wow. I wish we could highlight that a little bit.
Well, so a couple of things that you can do there is that's not spoken in that particular paragraph is the number of attempts, right? And essentially in each year that it was attempted and when it was ultimately successful, and if that successful outcome was the desired outcome, or if there was more to be had at the time. So we can take a look at that too.
That'd be great.
Generating the concept itself. So again, this speaks to training that's provided to staff, and we talked about the different sources of training. A good portion of that comes from the Department of Consumer Affairs, what we call solid or strategic organization leadership and individual development. But we'll also be listing the types of external trainings that we've used and what we've paid for. And probably the FSPPT trainings with board members.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
So section 4, the licensing program. This section is kind of new for applications and licensing. The board itself is familiar with performance measures as they relate to the enforcement program, of course, the performance measures 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. There are now an expectation of performance measures for applications and licensing, although arguably for the department to establish performance measures for applications and licensing was a much more difficult task than it was for enforcement purposes. Enforcement is somewhat uniform from one board and bureau to another. Even there are slight variations and changes that made it difficult to create these kind of standardized performance measures. In applications, even more so, right? So one board's application method could vary so greatly from another, and it's very difficult to establish performance measures. We established our own performance measures early on, and by the time the program was actually up and running, we had already changed our processes so significantly that the original performance measures no longer measured what we needed. And we've had that kind of problem now going on for about 3 years. We recently made a fairly significant change to the transaction inside of Breeze that calculates and processes the application transaction, which we think from this day moving forward will give just about as accurate information as you could possibly extrapolate from the system, but it won't be reflected in the sunset report because it's just been implemented, right? It's not something that you're going to be able to see back. So we're still kind of playing with this one and trying to figure out its best presentation, and here what you have is Sarah's narrative to try to explain some of that.
I am wondering if we can, do it as Sarah sees best fit, but also just make a table or spell it out, showing just how much our times have improved.
I think give them what they specifically asked for in the question, but in addition to that, what we anticipate going forward, even what we're collecting today, and then moving forward is something that we can certainly include.
And we can toot our horn a little bit here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to either way, whether it's in this sunset or the next, there's going to be this like significant improvement over those performance measure timelines. It's also kind of comparing apples to oranges. So the way the system was recorded before and the way we're recording application intake to ultimately license issuance now, I think there's a significant improvement there, but it's caused by other efficiencies realized. Changing it in the Breeze system is one of those efficiencies. But we're going to have good numbers, reliable numbers, but we had good, reliable numbers before in the sense that we were performing well. We just couldn't measure it as well.
Some of your numbers are much better now. They're like, if you were to look at 2 years ago, how long would it take for an endorsement candidate to get licensed? How long ago, how long would it take for a military spouse?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, now you're like turning it around. Yeah, regardless of what they're asking for. Right. I mean, that's a real statement to, present to the Joint Committee, I think.
And I see Sarah's camera popped on, so I think she might have something she'd like to say.
Well, thank you. I think that discussion just played out. That's all I wanted to add was Alicia, you had said that you wanted to lay out the numbers in in a table, and that is below. We're going to do some form of those numbers. It may not match exactly what the committee included in the template, but we'll try to address their questions and explain everything as much as possible, including those numbers. Because we do want to demonstrate what you were just talking about, which is, explain our performance, because it may not be reflected in the way that it's been measured, but with our own reports, we would like to be able to include that information. So yes, on all accounts, that's the plan.
Awesome. And all in the lens of a pandemic. All of these improvements are coming during a pandemic. So kudos to you, and we need to, I think, point that out to the Joint Committee.
And we also have, like you were talking about, the chart that shows the military and the endorsement. I'm hoping that we can even break out the information they've asked for even more, so we can provide them more data than they're even asking for.
Thanks, Sarah. So board members, please, by all means, unmute and just jump right in. It's fair game, and we want to hear from you too.
I did kind of want to touch on the established target times. And so what you see here in the chart were, I would say, maybe 3 years ago, we were asked to come up with what our performance measures should be for a given transaction. And so we've established these time frames that we thought were reasonable at the time. And it turns out we're kind of, spot on in some areas. And in some areas, we could have even shot a little bit lower, because only now we've kind of come up with some ways to distribute resources a little bit better, separate one transaction from another so that it's not held up by, artificial resistance or something like that. So we're in the narrative, we'll try to kind of loop that additional data that Sarah's talking about and relate them to these kind of performance measures. So there is something to look at and say, we want it to be 45 days, and, we're well within that range. Or we might have a little more work to do.
Mm-hmm.
So this section still just kind of relates to the table above it and an explanation of the performance measures themselves, how we go about doing eligibility for examinations, that kind of thing. Question Q is a little bit different in the sense that, it asks if there's been any increase or decrease in the average times to process. And again, we think that there's going to be a decrease in the average times to process, and we'll utilize this section to kind of highlight it. And like you said, kudos are always a good thing. So one of the things that I did want to kind of highlight today for you as members is this particular section as it relates to applicants with criminal history and the 2138 regulations and standards being applied. These are the actual numbers now. And we did think that the way the question was worded in the template is that we were going to have a pretty heavy lift in the data that we were going to have to provide about each individual denial.
Right.
Elsa's not here with us today, but this information was not used in our 2016 report. It wasn't relevant at the time. The legislation hadn't hit. But it did hit in the last legislative session. And so Elsa did go back and look at some other board sunset reports to see kind of how they answered this particular question. And we found a pretty decent template to use that was used in the medical board's report and was received well by the legislature. So we've used that kind of template language here. And so you can see over the last 4 fiscal years, there's only 11 cases that involve denial based on any kind of criminal history. And what you see below that is a description of each individual case in the fiscal year that it was in and what the ultimate outcome was. And a good 80 to 90% of the time, the outcome is that the applicant still made it into the profession. They just might have made it into the profession with some kind of restricted license. So some kind of conditions set in place to, adhere to public protection, not necessarily keep them out and keep a permanent denial, but allow them to practice just with safeguards in place. And for argument's sake, the numbers are kind of infinitesimal when you consider the number of applications received by this board in one fiscal year. It is pretty small, 1 to 2% at best at times. Any questions about that? Yeah, let's just scroll to where we can see the applicants for 1718. There are 5 of them. If you can highlight just one right in the middle where it starts with. Mm-hmm. So each one that starts with physical therapist applicant is an individual case.
Yeah, I like how it's written out.
And when we apply the ultimate formatting to it, it'll be a little bit more delineated so you can see that one case is separate from the other. It's very similar to the description that we provide to the National Practitioner Data Bank when we're reporting discipline for licensees. So it was kind of second nature for enforcement staff.
What questions or concerns do you anticipate Joint Committee having about this section, if any?
I don't actually think that there are going to be too many. I think if anything, one of the questions for us to kind of answer without being asked is to put it in that context. It's very easy to look at these numbers and just see numbers, but 11 over a 4 or 5 year period is, even saying that, you kind of get lost in how many or how little have been issued. You really have to look at the total number of applications received over that period of time or for that particular fiscal year. And I think we'll highlight that in the columns too, just so that they can see the number of applications received in this year and the number of actual denials. And then even the number that we're allowed to go on and continue to practice the continued license, so that they can really kind of put it all into context.
Yeah.
There is this kind of misnomer or misunderstanding of information that a lot of licensees are being stopped from making it to the profession based on criminal history. So here you see, and if you just hold it right there. So for fiscal year 17-18, oh, this is not the one I was looking at. So this is just the general licensing population. The whole number broken down in categories by licensure status, current, inactive, delinquent, so on and so forth. And then 4 fiscal years worth of data, and you can see it's kind of pretty steady. It doesn't fluctuate too much, but the licensing population as a whole has grown pretty significantly over the last 4 years. So here are some application numbers received. And so like you can see, so in fiscal year, we received a little over 2,000 applications, and you put that into context with the 5 potential denials that received them. And out of those 5 denials, what was the ultimate outcome for those cases? It's pretty favorable.
And I can just add that the chart below, that's just an insert of some data that we've collected that's related to the chart above. It's just formatted differently, and we're going to have, again, it's matching our data to what they're asking for and working on how to present that. So but all of that information is part of one request, one chart.
And this kind of goes along with not just Breeze, but also our ability, learning how to pull data out of the system and actually create reportable points. And so here is a pretty good example of the average number of days for application processing times, but some of it's a little, I wouldn't say misleading. Some of it's easy to misunderstand, I guess is probably a better way to describe it, because of the way the transaction data is being collected in Breeze. It has some explanation has to come with it.
Yeah.
And then similar to the tables in 7A is just consistent, but also for PTA, same kind of trend data. And then here you'll see, again, the mention of license denial and other categories like statement of issues filed, who's contested and who hasn't contested, and that kind of thing. So some of these questions have written by staff have also had, we've had the benefit of having the committee with both Jesus and Tanya provide kind of feedback and help us craft that kind of narrative. This section was a good example of that, where we were talking about how does the board verify and the fingerprint-based background check and that kind of thing. And one of the questions being, is it necessary to really kind of call out 2138 and the differences? Well, that difference occurred during this particular sunset period. And there was a pretty significant change in how staff was involved in the process with the applicant, where we could typically before 2138 went into effect, we leaned on and relied statutorily on the applicant to provide that data, that information, those certified copies from a jurisdiction, a court, or arresting agency. And then after 2138 being prohibited from doing that and only having that information such as our staff could collect or what was being provided in a rap sheet based on their fingerprints. So I think it's a very valuable piece of information and we left it in. Here we do cite our participation with the National Practitioner Data Bank and how we rely on FSDPT as our proxy to, when we report to the ELDB, they go on and forward on to the National Practitioner Data Bank on our behalf. Primary source documents, we require just about everything primary source. We can establish some of those things primary source electronically if we can verify the place that it was transmitted from. And when we can do that, we try. But because we do utilize primary source documentation, it can create some delay in obtaining that. So this section U is not new, but it's certainly a hot topic, and that's how the board handles any kind of military education, training, and experience for the purposes of licensing. And for us, that would be the equivalency by PTAs, where they can transfer their military experience and essentially use any kind of education, push it forward through the application process and have it considered as equivalency application. Most, if not at all, at this point, we see very few military applicants who haven't gone through a CAPT program at this point. The military utilizes CAPT almost solely for PTs now. For physical therapy assistants, we still see applications once in a while that utilize the equivalency rate or the equivalency application process. And as you can see, we kind of answer to that in the narrative. That last section on 3, which is on the screen, is Roman numeral 5. But no longer interested in essentially anyone that has had an application or a license with the board, but for whatever reason is no longer licensed or abandoned their application. We can't continue to receive the subsequent arrest notifications for their fingerprints. So we'll file a no longer interested notification to the Department of Justice. And now that can be done electronically through the BREEZE system through reporting. So as licensees go into a canceled status, shortly after that, there is a batch report that is transmitted to the DOJ to process that no longer interested.
That's all still a work in progress. Some of that.
Yeah. So some of this is And as you can see, as the questions have not been answered yet, it's just we haven't had a chance to, as staff, craft narrative for the committee to review just yet. A good example of that would be, school approvals, where you haven't seen the narrative there. Nothing much has changed in the way we do school approvals, though, relying on CAPT's certification. So there's a good possibility that the narrative is just going to be duplicative of the 2016 report. We have continuing education. The only thing that I'm going to add or have Sarah and staff add to that section is kind of an explanation of the waiver process and how it's affected the board. We're going to be, like here we've listed the percentage of licensees audited, but we'll also include the percentage of pass rate as well. Mm-hmm. But as we list it by fiscal year, the last 2 fiscal years are going to have no values, and we'll have to provide kind of an asterisk explanation of COVID-19 and the waiver over continued competency, and kind of an explanation of not knowing when we're going to be able to return to audits, but at the earliest possible date where we could rely on it. Mm-hmm. As we're transitioning to Section 5 of the deal, right, to request a barrel?
Yes, absolutely.
So we'll leave it right there for a second.
All right, so 10-minute recess. Roll call vote at 5 after 2. Not roll call vote, roll call after 5 after 2. Thanks. Hello, this is President Rabina Ahmed, and we are back from a brief recess. Can we have a roll call, please?
Alicia Ben Ahmed.
Here.
Bill Armstrong.
Here.
Jesus Dominguez.
Here.
Daniel Drummer. Daniel Drummer is absent. Katarina Ellaby.
Present.
Jonathan Irvin. Jonathan Irvin is absent. Tanya McMillian. Tanya McMillian is absent. All members are present with the exception of Daniel Drummer, Jonathan Irvin, and Tanya McMillian, and the board has a quorum.
Fantastic. Thank you. Where did we leave off, Mr. Kaiser?
Section 5, which is the start of the enforcement program.
Okay.
So here, like you saw earlier in the kind of the formatting of the report, they want to start with the performance measures themselves. So here we're starting enforcement, performance measures 1, complaints received, and you'll see over the fiscal year, or the last 4 fiscal years, through here demonstrated, that we've actually had a pretty significant drop in the number of complaints received. That number, that 320, that 309, that 247, those numbers comprise of both consumer complaints, and those can be driven by consumers, licensees, employers, insurance companies, what have you. But those numbers also include the criminal conviction numbers that we receive. So if you want to scroll down a little bit, intake is one of those numbers where we've always met the measure. The target number of days from the receipt of intake to assigned to an analyst, the target is 9, and we typically hover around 3 or 4. So target met, yes. I think that speaks more to the size and structure of the way we do things. There are some boards that have a much more kind of, well, one, they have a much larger licensing population, and they have, as a result of having a larger licensing population, they have a much more compartmentalized enforcement program. And so sometimes that intake number results in a higher number because it's being handled by a specific unit within the enforcement program. So the target number of 9 is a good target, generally speaking, for the whole department, but doesn't really represent us very well. Intake target performance. Again, target numbers, that 9 days, but here, we've always met the measure. I have to Oh, these are separation of fiscal years.
Yes.
Okay. The same measure, just different fiscal years. And scroll a little bit. Yeah, we've never had an issue with that performance measure. We've always measured it. You can see in that second quarter of 2021, we did have a few extra days tacked on. And if you think about just kind of the period of time, that was the onset of COVID-19. And we were just really getting comfortable with the idea of going home and working from home and telework. And that was prior to the equipment being distributed that kind of allowed for a seamless transition. So we're going to take us there a little bit.
Jason?
Measure. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, real quick, very small point. I'm following along on my desktop version, but did you want to share the screen?
Oh.
Yeah. Hold on.
Or maybe
Thank
I'm
you.
just, no, not at all. I'm just, I have a PDF, but no worries. Thank you.
I was just trying to figure out how I could see it and how you couldn't. I'll save that for later.
I was seeing through your eyes, sir, when you said, as you can see. Sure.
Yeah. Performance measures 3, intake to investigation. If you could scroll down a little bit, look for that one. You'll see here sometimes that's where we can fall short. And so we don't meet the measure of that 90 days. Part of that is typically because of the way that the measure happens. The other part is just our backlog with the Division of Investigation. We can send it over, but we have to go through that kind of prioritization matrix first, and DFI actually has to vet that case and decide which analyst or which investigator would be appropriate for that case before they assign it. So sometimes we exceed those timelines. Again, I say sometimes because while our average is higher than the 90 days, some of those cases could be 200 and 300 days to really skew the statistic. Where a good majority of them could be in the opposite of skewing the statistic and be much shorter. We typically operate right around 60 days to 75 days with a few outliers. So. And you can see under comment for PM3, also it's given a brief explanation of how that happened. And I think she'll give you, while 56% of investigation cases are closed within the 90-day target, a small number of cases take much longer due to multiple factors such as complication and detailed evidentiary requirements to prove allegations, lack of response from the participants and the parties, and workload and staffing issues that have little to no control by the PCBC. Kind of a constant frustration, but something that we're always trying to monitor and do better in. Formal discipline, you'll see that for like the first time in a long time, we had a couple of years where we could actually meet that measure of the 540 days. And it also provides further context of kind of breaking down those cases and how many were completed. And I think this is a good way to do this when you're actually looking at this data, because if you just look at the table and only the table, it doesn't really answer much, right? But when you actually try to split it up and you see an overwhelming majority of the cases were done within 1 to 2 years, right? 43 cases within 2 years, as opposed to, you know, a dozen cases practically that really skewed statistics.
I wonder if that would be a good way to break out cases in performance measure 1. That performance measure 1 that we, no, 3.
And so she kind of has a little bit narratively speaking,
Right.
but we could probably do it where we outline the actual number of cases.
If it looked compelling, that might be something to consider, but. Yeah.
We'll make a note to look at that and see how the data bears out and if it's worth doing.
Yeah.
Alicia, to your point, I was thinking the same thing. Like, and Jason, is it allowable to add more information in those blocks? So it asks for average days, but again, Alicia said, well, sometimes this is a small number of cases and 1 or 2 outliers really skews things. So to be able to, in addition to the average days report, something like the median, like half of them are under, half of them are over, or range to give some sense of, hey, there's a lot of times where we're hitting these marks way under the benchmark.
Right. The guidance that we've received in the past is please stick to the template, but it's always kind of followed up with, unless there's something that you think is compelling that the template doesn't reveal, you know. So to the extent that we can, that's why we've chosen to kind of keep the templates intact and then provided that narrative after that. I like your idea though with, you know, trying to kind of put the range of those cases in the template or in the table itself. We'll play with it and see how it looks. We also have the consultants, you know, that we can rely on. We can give a phone call and run something by and see what they think. The template, as you see it today, has some changes in it as a result of recommendations that were made by the Department of Consumer Affairs. There's a lot more recommendations that the department made that are going to be accepted, but they're not going to show up until the next legislative session. So we got a couple advantages in this one, but it won't really be until the next round of sunsets that you'll see those recommendations come through. And some of those recommendations are similar to what you're saying. But that doesn't mean that we can't, you know, try to squeeze it in and tweak it as we see fit. Again, they kind of left the door open for that by saying, unless, you know, it makes a compelling difference and it helps them understand the data better.
Well, I think at our last board meeting, I don't remember which reports they were, but we were presented reports that actually told us how many days something sat at our staff members' desk. Mm-hmm. And it was very few days, and the majority of the time was outside of our board. So I don't know if that can be included, but I mean,
it can be. I want to be careful with that only in the sense that when we provide that to you, it kind of shows the in control, out of control ratio. Mm-hmm. But I don't want the in control, out of control ratio to serve as an excuse. And at the same time, I don't want to like lay blame outside, because the in control, out of control ratio oftentimes is completely appropriate and understanding, right? So take as an example, forwarding the case onto the division investigation for a sworn peace officer and an expert consultant to go out and do an on-site visit for a case that involves multiple victims, multiple patient record review. And, you know, you get 20 patients that we have to review records for, and maybe of those 20 patients, we're reviewing 7 to 10 days of records at a time. Mm-hmm. That expert consultant's report is going to take that much longer to complete.
Right.
And it's not just expected, it's totally acceptable. But it skews these numbers.
Yes.
And I think that's the part that gets missed in this kind of conversation of performance measure. That's still a very well-performing case. Right? The expert's doing an excellent job. The advice is moving as quickly as they possibly can. But the case itself is extremely complex and warrants that kind of, you know, high-level investigation. Unfortunately, you know, when we set this kind of arbitrary, all cases should be handled in 18 months, we didn't take into account that, you know, the world doesn't turn at that pace sometimes. And the other side of it is the complainant in the matter going to continue to participate, or have their patients worn thin? Or have they been incentivized by other means, such as a legal remedy, such as malpractice or something like that, so they don't even know if they can continue to participate? And is even the respondent going to participate at the level that you would expect them to? And we know that once a case involves multiple attorneys, that can become kind of a very stagnant process, because everyone's due process then becomes the highest priority.
Yeah.
So,
you know, I'm trying to, when we're going through this, I'm trying to put on the perspective of the Joint Committee members. Like, what are they looking for? Like, why are they asking us for this information? And I guess, without knowing any better, I'm thinking they want to know, how is our board performing? Our work's performing fine.
They do want to know, but they're also kind of seeking the golden fleece, right? They're looking for the magic solution. They have stakeholders that are bringing problems of satisfaction to them as their local representative, senator, assemblyman, what have you. That surely there's no way these cases should take this long. And on average, I agree. I don't think they should be taking that long either. But if you really drill into the averages, is the average really the average? Or is it exaggerated by an outlier?
Right.
And if that's the case, tell the story so that everyone involved, even the person that is the initial complainant, is saying the case shouldn't take that long. Cases should not take that long. They typically don't. 80% of the cases are resolved within the time frames. You know, and saying it like that, I think will help, you know, educate the public in receiving that data.
Yeah.
Because all they hear is, no, they're not within the time frame. Well, of course they're not within the time frame because everything's too slow. The context really should be provided. We'll do what we can here. And I think even there is a contingent in our audience that even when we say something like 80% of the cases are well within the time frame, that's still not a passing grade in their mind, right? And so all cases are handled within that 18 months. And that's, again, just a lack of education. They're not taking each individual case into consideration.
Yeah, and I think it's those opinions that I'm thinking, you know, I hope they know, because if we aren't saying it here, I hope they know we're doing what we're supposed to do.
I believe the best way for you as members to determine whether or not the legislature gets it or doesn't get it is by the outcome of your sunset report. Right? If you're extended for 4 to 5 years, the legislature got it. You're doing the right thing. There's no reason to bring you back any earlier or monitor or have you justify your existence in the sooner. If you're being brought back within a year or 2 years, then there's troubleshooting to be done. And the legislature has a concern that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. So really with these performance measures, I mean, we're just doing what we've always done with them. We're just reporting them out and
And at the same time, we will try to take it as an opportunity to educate kind of the granular data that is behind them. Before you go right there, so one of the things that I did to add to our conversation is the remaining 58 cases were carried over to the following fiscal year. That's a surprise. You know, it's always been kind of surprising to me, but it's sometimes a difficult concept to understand that when you're trying to measure things like this in a fiscal year, cases span multiple fiscal years. So, while it's very easy for me to say, when you're actually looking at numbers don't always add up. When you see you took in 300 cases, the public feels like you should have resolved 300 cases. The numbers should just nicely add up. And it doesn't really work like that, obviously, especially when we're talking about 18 months being the ideal. It's going to span 2 fiscal years, if not more sometimes. And so when that happens and those numbers don't kind of easily add up, it causes the end user, in this case, sometimes a legislative staffer, a senator, assemblyman, or their constituent, to call question to the data and just point at it and say, see, the numbers don't even add up. Well, they're never going to add up. You could use the same description for license applications received and license issued. Those numbers should be similar in time because it's this kind of roller coaster continuing workflow. But they're never going to add up to be the same because the applications that were received in this fiscal year, sometimes if you receive the application in December, you can't have an expectation that the license is going to be issued before the end of the year. It's going to flow into the next year. So again, it's just kind of trying to make the information as easily digestible as possible.
Jason, to your point, once a case gets extended into the next year, once it's past 540 days, like a year and a half. So for example, those cases that went for more than 4 years, they continue to skew the data for subsequent years because they're going to be reported as, you know.
Absolutely. They carry from last year's report into this year's report, and theoretically could be carried into next year's report if that particular case takes that long.
Right. To resolve. Yep.
Yeah. I guess one thing here, and to Elsa's note on this particular section is, you know, part of the fluctuation that you see in those averages, because sometimes, like in that first quarter, the number was great, and then in the second quarter, it just blew up. And kind of to what Jesus was just saying, that happens to be when one of those cases that has racked up the most amount of days finally comes to closure, right? And it lands. Well, it landed in quarter 2 here and just skewed the number all out. But thank God the case is done and over with. You know, we finally got it off the book. You know, I know, speaking on behalf of the analysts at the PTBC, they prioritize their cases based on that aging, meaning as soon as those cases are a little over a year old, they really start to get this kind of heightened priority. You know, they check them more often than they check other cases. They bug the Attorney General about those cases more than any other cases, or B of I or something like that. Because they're aware of the case aging too, and they're trying as much as they can to make these numbers go down. But to Elsa's point here, when we send a lot of cases to the AG, you'll see a backlog happen there. I mean, as those cases were freed up from my staff and sent on to the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General's office has a limited set of resources too. Yeah. So especially with these cases that are, you know, unusually complex and take a great number of time, it takes them away from those more routine cases, and it's even having an effect on their timeline as well. Okay, but so this last performance measure pertains to the board's probation monitor for probation intake. As you can see, he always makes his mark. Essentially, once an effective date of a disciplinary order for probation goes into effect, Monty has a certain amount of time to actually reach out and make contact with that particular probationer and get them set up. You'll see here in 2021 that 8, I would suggest is also kind of affected by COVID-19 as well. Not from staff's perspective, not between Monty and not between the probationer, but you're talking about some of those conditions being that they find a supervising PT or that they find a practice monitor, but during COVID-19, they don't even have a job. Right? And so sometimes those things can kind of get stretched out, and it did have a little bit of an effect on them. So getting people to participate in that can be a little bit difficult. But he does provide a little bit of insight into how he's been doing those things and how probation monitoring has happened subsequent to COVID. So for this one, once a probationer has actually violated their probation, we want to know exactly how long did it take before the board was able to take action on it. And as you'll see, the target is 7. Sometimes that could be something that is actually still out of the board's control. As an example, if there's a substance abuse disorder and a probationer proves positive for a controlled substance, what's the offense date? Is the offense date the receipt of the test result, or was the offense date the date that the urine sample was submitted? And sometimes those lab results can take a while to get back and confirm before the board is willing to actually take action on it. And so that data can be a little iffy too, but you'll see there's always about an outlier. The outlier is supported in explanation by the 2 next years, where if there is a violation of probation that involves something else, such as just failure to participate, we could take action on the day it occurs. And you'll see the average number of days is 1. But I don't know for certain, but I'm pretty sure the 1819 case had to do with relying on and waiting on your analysis results. So here are our enforcement statistics, and you're familiar with them because we report similar data to this in every agenda, every board agenda material item for enforcement. We go through here and we do list out what the sources of the complaint were. That's something that's probably not as familiar to members, but here they're categorized based on a code that's generated from Breeze. And then a few other kind of what we call sub-performance measures, such as average time to refer for investigation, which is to B of I, or average time to closure from. And then you'll see statistics for investigation, how many were open, how many were closed within that fiscal year. And again, those are the numbers that I was talking about earlier that some people expect to match, and they just never will because of pending cases.
Can you go over the source of complaints?
Sure.
Which each group is?
So that's up. So public is what we would consider the majority, except for internal. So internal can be any case that is spawned from another case, or what we call a companion case. Or oftentimes, sometimes we see something in the media or in an investigation. As an example, an analyst can be reviewing a website that is involved in that one case and see something that's a violation of the Practice Act. That will result in a second case being opened for that particular item. And so that's why the 229 you'll see internal is usually pretty high. I think that's a good indicator of proactive staff. You know, it's a board-initiated complaint, or even just a companion case that they've attached to a previous complaint. Public is our most prolific number after that, and that we would consider consumers themselves or recipients of PT services. Licensed professional groups, either the association or a consumer watchdog group, or a fellow licensee. And fellow licensee could be categorized as both PT and PTA, but it could also be practitioner, physician, surgeon, chiropractor, speech pathologist, so on and so forth. Government agencies is typically a referral by another board, and also criminal convictions. Other, I don't know, I'll have to look into that one. Something that just does not fit into a category above. But anonymous is an issue for us, and as you can see, you know, out of the total number of complaints received for that time, you know, 50 being anonymous is a little over 10% of our cases. Anonymous complaints are very difficult to investigate. Sometimes an anonymous complaint doesn't even have enough detail in it for us, for the board or investigators to take action of any kind. They could be something as simple as there's a practice downtown that is, you know, hurting its patients. And that's the simplicity of the complaint. We will do what we can to try and track that complaint down to get more information, but sometimes they leave us with little to no contact information, so it can be very difficult.
Thank you for that.
Yep. So if there's any stats or statistics in this particular template that, you know, cause question, concern, comment, or, you know, you'd like further explanation, please let me know. All right, so now we're into enforcement agent cases, and again, we kind of reviewed through explanation some of the things, but this really does kind of help to demonstrate how some of those cases can really skew statistics and provide a little bit of commentary about that, hoping that the reader can kind of understand that 18 months may not be sufficient amount of time depending on the case.
This is a nice chart.
Really, it's our attempt again at trying to bring that clarity to say, while we may not have met the performance measure, if we categorize these standards in kind of a pass-fail system, like the number of complaints that were resolved within 18 months would be considered pass, and the number that weren't were fail, this would help kind of feather that out, and at a good 80% of the time that it's done.
I wonder if that chart might go a little after the performance measures.
You mean just location and report?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something to think about.
Question HH refers to kind of a common question that we receive in the sunset template, is that the legislature trying to understand kind of how cases are prioritized. DCA has a very structured priority matrix with the Department of Investigation, or the Division of Investigation. So while we adhere to their priority matrix, we do stray from it once in a while. You know, sometimes we do ask the AVI to investigate a case that doesn't quite fit on the matrix very well, and where they might say it's too low of a case and that case should be handled by board staff or board resources. We do ask that the AVI intervene on our behalf, because once we've looked into the case a little bit more, we realize that there really is need for a sworn peace officer or a subpoena to be served or something like that. And so while we adhere to the matrix as much as we can, there are times where we deviate from it. The next section is about mandatory reporting requirements. Dr. Dominguez and I had an interesting conversation about this, because as this report template was structured, it was structured for all of DCA boards. And not all boards have the same mandatory reporting requirements. And one of the questions is, do we have difficulty receiving them? And we have a small bit of language in there that says, you know, there are some mandatory reporting requirements that our licensees are to adhere to. And without knowing it, it's hard for the board to determine whether they're being reported timely or not. And that's a very plausible explanation. The real source of the curiosity of this question, I believe, is more issued at some of the other healthcare boards who have mandatory reporting requirements as it pertains to clinics, hospitals, that kind of setting, where a board or a committee of the hospital has sanctioned a member of its staff. For a good portion of time, there was no obligation for that committee to report that to the licensing agency, and that legislation's changed over time. We're not included in that particular one. We are now included in the one that has to do with malpractice lawsuits. And if the hospital has issued has paid a malpractice lawsuit, $2,500 or more that involves a physical therapist, we will receive that report. And to my knowledge, we've never had difficulty receiving that. But if a physical therapist was disciplined by a hospital, there's no mandatory obligation for that hospital to tell us. So it's difficult to determine whether or not there's anything we could do there to include it. And it also has applied just about every statute and CCR that is considered mandatory reporting into that paragraph. So the dollar threshold for settlement reporting is $3,000. Sometimes you will see settlements written for $2,999 to try to avoid this mandatory reporting requirement. So, and sometimes that works, and sometimes we get them anyway. So. Highlighted there the data that we just haven't collected that data yet, but I will tell you, it's not a very large portion of our intake on complaints. We don't get a lot of settlement, malpractice settlement reports. And I think if you look just on a national level, that jives with the data that we're collecting for physical therapists and malpractice in general. So here we're talking about some of the outcomes of discipline. What is the number of cases pre-accusation that the board settled for the past 4 years? A good portion of our cases are stipulated settlement. And so you'll see most of the time over the last few years, when possible, we will try to enter into stipulation, as long as in doing so we can still adhere to consumer protection and build a protective order that really caters to physical therapy services. But you see that in 2018-19, where we did actually have to go to hearing 8 times. That was kind of an outlier. But once 19-20 comes around, and then this last fiscal year, I think COVID has really kind of slowed things down quite a bit too. Looks a little bit like one of the questions that the legislature asks, because it has proven to be an issue or a problem for some other boards, is if the board has a statute of limitations. Within the PT Practice Act, we have no statute of limitations, so there's no difficulty in prosecuting or investigating and adjudicating a case within the statutory limitations. So the answer here is simple, and I think it's again, this is one of those kind of questions that's asked department-wide. And for us, because we already have the advantage of not having to be restricted by the statute of limitations, we can provide that as benefit. Unlicensed activity, again, this is a general question department-wide. There are a number of boards within DCA that do have a significant issue with unlicensed activity, as you can imagine. Barber and cosmetology, dentistry, the contractor state licensing board, those kind of things. It's a little bit more difficult to hold yourself out as a physical therapist and still get paid for it in an insurance-based system. We see it once in a while, but it looks more like one license scope of practice infringing on another sometimes, or a physical therapist kind of aiding and abetting a physical therapist assistant in the unlicensed practice of physical therapy. So it's not quite the same definition that we think of when we think about unlicensed activity. And we provide that as explanation as an answer from the last one set. Here we cite our cite and fine authority, and we kind of talk about the process and how it's used. And then I believe, we'll have a table of informal conferences and hearings based off of what citations are issued. We just haven't collected that data yet. Cost recovery and restitution, again, we kind of touched on it when we were talking about our fiscal situation and our ability to retrieve costs from the bad actors instead of distributing them amongst the licensing population. And so you'll see a table here that specifically lists out the number of cases that involved it, and then some of the amounts of cost recovery ordered. Cost recovery ordered versus cost recovery collected are always going to be two different things because of date ranges as well. And I think sometimes it's difficult sometimes for people to understand that, but we're going to have to go back into here and look at actually what was collected. Typically what we see based on ordered is usually around 30 to 40% of recouped costs. So like in that first category of 172,000, you can expect to see about $50,000 to $60,000. And the reason being is after a provisional order is issued and cost recovery is ordered, that licensee can choose to just release their license, right? To surrender their license voluntarily. Maybe there's something about the order, or they're close to retirement age anyway, or something like that. And once that happens, that would contribute to cost recovery not cashed in, for lack of a better word. But so the number's never going to be the same. But again, to the extent that we can collect cost recovery, we're going to.
Jason, is that 30% more or less? Is that consistent across other boards, other health professions? In other words, are we kind of right on what would typically be expected in terms of, what we can recover from what was ordered?
Unfortunately, it's kind of like an apples to oranges comparison because not all boards have cost recovery authority to begin with, right? The best and most classic example is the medical board does not have cost recovery authority, although I believe they have a statutory change coming where they're going to have statutory authority to do cost recovery. And some boards statutory recovery or statutory cost recovery is definitive. It defines how much can actually be collected. And it also goes about saying, the person can actually practice until certain fees are paid. And ours isn't quite so burdensome, but it's because of the nature of the practice. So if you think of other professions like the Bureau of Security and Information Services that licenses, 42 some odd different professions from locksmiths to security guards or something like that. If they've issued cost recovery, they may not want to turn around and issue a license to that person until that cost recovery is paid. And so their authority is a little bit different, and because of that, the percentage of collection might be higher than ours. But typically, I think we do a pretty good job at trying to recoup costs. We only track a couple different types of costs. We could, the adjudication costs for the Department of the Attorney General, and then our divisional investigation. As of yet, we have yet to calculate our own internal costs when it comes to an analyst. It's, how much money has been expended by a PTBC employee or something like that. We just don't have the time tracking software features yet. So, in comparison to other boards and bureaus, I think we're pretty good, but that's just an answer off the top of my head. I don't really have anything to establish a baseline. And so you'll see like here, the number of cases even that are potential cases for recovery has actually gone down over the last couple of years. Doesn't necessarily mean the amount of cost has gone down. And when we talk about the Attorney General's office and the cases for adjudication, the cost that we actually pay the DOJ going up, there's a good example of how the dollar amount hasn't gone down, but the number of cases have. So each case has become that much more expensive to pursue. Any questions about the enforcement section of the report before we move on to public information? Okay. So this section speaks to a number of different areas of public protection and the way we interact with the public. And so most of these questions are very similar to the answers that we provided in 2016, but some of them do have some tweaks that are going to be made. Some have already been made. The way we utilize WebEx is going to have an effect on that as a result of COVID-19. Our retention schedule switching to most of our information being available online. As you can see, like the webcast archive and how often we refresh that. The calendar, how accessible is the board? Do we post that calendar ahead of time? How much time do we use in crafting that calendar? And I think we use some of the, what I would consider, best practice kind of standards. As members, you are usually deciding a calendar a year in advance. We're always talking about next year's calendar. You can find it in the materials. We put it on the board's website. None of our board meetings are really a surprise to the public. They've been on there for quite some time. So Some of the things that we talk about with the complaint disclosure policy, is it consistent with DCA's recommended minimum standards? And ours definitely is. Most of the complaint form that's actually incorporated into briefs was built off of that recommended minimum standard. So we're good on that. What information does the board provide to the public regarding its licensees? The board provides information to the public regarding its licensees in many ways, and we talk about not just license verification, but issuing discipline in our progress notes through our newsletter twice a year. That speaks to not just discipline, but also any citations that were issued during that same period of time. Very transparent, open with the data, trying to let the consumers make an educated guess in what services they receive. How do we communicate with consumer outreach? Again, newsletter, social media platforms, the ability for the public to sign up for e-blast, those kind of things, but there's going to be some updating of that language. So. Any questions there? Okay. Section 7 is similar to that online practice or unlicensed practice issue that you saw above. Again, this template was written for department-wide. Online practice issues don't really affect physical therapy. Even with the advent of telemedicine and the prevalence of telemedicine during COVID, we haven't seen an issue of online practice that's generated this kind of idea of unlicensed practice. We see our licensees utilizing it much more, but it hasn't increased any kind of unlicensed activity that we're aware of. Section 8 has to do with workforce development and job creation. This one's a little bit difficult for a regulator. So some of our tenured members might remember FSB2T's minimum data set and the data that would be collected, both demographic and representative data about race, creed, ethnicity, sex, those kind of things. We tend to steer away from that as a regulator. We don't really collect much of it. There will be as a result of change of legislation, there will be an opportunity for our licensees to answer to some of those questions in the near future through a survey that's as a result of the transaction in brief. But again, it will be voluntary. It wouldn't be something that's being mandated or required of our licensees. But there are some boards within the department that have actual statutory mandates to collect this information. And so this question pertains more to them than it does to us. Some of the next few questions talk about some of our outreach kind of initiatives. What do we do to work with schools? And we're kind of toot our own horn with our communication education analysts and some of the potential positive outcomes that have come as a result of that. Describing the barriers, we did talk about, and this is a cut and paste from the last report, but we did talk about TOEFL, the examination of English proficiency, being a barrier when we don't actually have exemptions in place for people who are educated in areas that relatively spoke English.
I would maybe consider along the same lines the requirement for a supervised clinical practice to have a clinical instructor who is CCIP level 1 certified.
Ooh. Okay. That's a good catch.
And I think, we've had conversation about that in the last 5 years.
That's a really good catch.
Since that last sunset, I don't think, we talked about it before then, but since then we have talked about it.
I'm surprised that hasn't come up earlier in this conversation.
Well, there's a lot, because it's meaty, there's a lot here to get through, but I would Yeah, add that in, or consider adding that in anyway. The subcommittee can look at it.
Yes. And then again, back to workforce data. Are there any kind of workforce shortages? It's very difficult for us to determine that. You know, we do rely on some other external data sources, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so on. But this is a growing profession, and in California has been able to demonstrate that too, just through its growth of its licensing population. Successful training programs. You know, we do have some data that we can kind of extrapolate out of that as far as how programs perform in both the national examination and our jurisprudence exam. And we've demonstrated that here. And that concludes that portion of the report. And then we go into current issues, which we've already kind of discussed. I'll go back up to section 9 a second. So these are some of the things that the committee is still really interested in when it comes to things like the uniform standards for substance abusing licensees. There are leftover questions, and the question is so broad. You know, what is the status of the board's implementation? This board's been utilizing the substance abusing standards for many years now. And so we'll fill in the answers there. And a lot of it will be kind of cut and paste from the 2016 report. The Consumer Protection Enforcement Initiative was a legislative change that happened about 7 years ago that really kind of looked at how long it takes for a consumer complaint to be addressed, and that's where we came up with that 18-month number. And so we'll kind of touch narrative in that area too, and we'll add back to our results from our performance measures. And then again, there's a couple more questions about Breeze. So it's all pretty routine. Section 10 is kind of a completely new section, obviously, because of the global pandemic. Staff and I are still kind of crafting narrative and data to put into this section of the report, but we'll be, you know, taking advantage and utilizing the committee as much as we can. I think we have some data for them to look at next Tuesday. Section 11 talks about what issues this board has identified through sunset in the past. And as you can see, issue number 1 was updating the fee statute, which we're again identifying this time. Clarifying revisions to retired status, which we consider to be resolved as a sunset issue because we're promulgating regulatory language to solve that issue based off of statute 464. Issue number 3 was the technical corrections to the cross-reference as a result of SB 198, and we consider that to be resolved as well. And then issue number 4 goes back to that TOEFL examination, if there are any exemptions for that English proficiency examination as a result of where they were educated, being in English-speaking schools, that kind of thing, whether it be Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, or the United Kingdom, or the United States, and we consider that issue to be resolved as well. Treatment plan of care for children covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. We consider this one to be resolved as well, as based on a statute change in the last legislative session that brought clarity of whether a diagnosis is available to the treatment team under IDEA. And then section 12 are those new issues that we've raised and discussed earlier today, pursuing the statutory cap, editing for WebEx language, and then taking the director's waiver for direct access and removing the words in person and utilizing those as new issues. Dr. Rabina Amen gave me a new idea for a new issue. It might be, like, we might call out the idea of the use of a clinical instructor or the necessity of a clinical instructor, APTA certified. We might go so far as identifying it actually as an issue to be resolved. it would require legislative change,
Yeah,
and the committee could help us with that.
yeah. And, you know, what the board wants, we discuss and see what the board wants.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we'll work with Jesus and Tanya, kind of review the statute, what we think is an impingement, and identify what kind of change might work. And if there's something that, you know, the committee elects to bring forward to the members at the December meeting, we'll bring it forward then. Section 13 is just commonplace attachment things that we always have to include as part of the sunset, the administrative manual, our org chart, any of those major studies that we don't have any of, and then year-end organizational charts for the last fiscal year so that they can actually see the growth and where the growth occurred. So, and I believe that concludes the report.
Can I go back to one section, please? It is on page 24 of 65 at the bottom, staffing issues. Describe staffing issues, challenges, efforts to reclassify positions. And so I just want to make sure that in this section we paint an accurate and complete picture of what the board has attempted to do with reclassifying the executive officer position, our asks and our denials. I mean, I'm not sure how the other board members feel, like how much of an exclamation point we want to put on it, but I mean, even a chart that showed every attempt and every denial, maybe even including that DCA did its own, you know, research and found that we are not classified correctly, but yet still we're unsuccessful at getting that exempt level change.
Yeah, so what we were talking about earlier when we were reviewing this area, we talked about kind of beefing up the historical accounts a little bit more, providing a little bit more detail, the number of attempts, when and what happened. And I think that argument becomes more compelling as time goes on because the board continues to grow, staff continues to increase, the budget continues to increase, that kind of thing. So we can definitely inject some additional rationale into that paragraph.
As far as any legislative action, I'm guessing that our hands would be tied for any action to occur here during sunset.
The board has legislative authority now to select the executive officer and other types of staff, or counsel, investigators, those kind of things. We're still subject to kind of CaliChart approval. I don't know that there's a statutory change to be had that to provide the remedy that we're seeking. But having said that, I don't know. We could certainly broach that with a consultant from the BNP and see what they have to say about the idea. We could arrange that time. That would be a conversation that I think it would be you as president would have with the consultant. I can make that contact and arrangement.
Okay.
But we'll definitely take a look at that language and see how much of it, how much more rationale we could provide.
Yes, Jesus?
Sorry about that. I cut you both off, I think. Jason, would the consultants need, I assume they would need some background, some context to this right before they sort of gave an opinion or a suggestion or a direction?
Yeah, I mean, I could brief them. We have all of the packages that we've submitted. Those packages have very compelling narratives of what we were seeking, what we were trying to achieve. So I could definitely provide that to them and brief them prior to the meeting that we arranged with the board president. Really, my understanding is we're just seeking what kind of legislative assistance we might be able to obtain in pursuit of that restructuring.
And, yeah, it could be, sorry, but
Sure.
we're just asking.
Sure. The question's here for a reason. You know, they're asking for us to demonstrate any kind of difficulties in reclassifying positions. This fits into that definition very nicely. So we could, like I said, we can make a note to reach out to the B&P committee and see if we can schedule a time for both these.
Okay.
This is one of those topics that's difficult for me to discuss because I happen to be sitting in the seat that it directly affects.
Mm-hmm.
So just, you know, trying to keep the separation and assuring that there's no kind of conflict of interest or anything like that. You know, I'll make myself available to you as the president, but that's certainly a conversation that would have to be had between you and the consultant.
Okay. So this report is certainly a lot of meat and potatoes. Kat, do you have any questions or comments about what's before us so far?
No, I don't necessarily have any questions at this point.
Thank you. How about you, Dale?
I think that it's, for a draft, it's looking very good. A lot of work has been done. I did read the first report and, you know, looking at a side by side, it looks like we're on track.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Jesus?
I mean, no comments other than to give Jason and board staff kudos. I'm looking at last year, or sorry, not last year's, but the previous sunset report of 2016, a beefy 182 pages.
Ooh.
So we're, yeah.
Wow.
A lot of attachments.
Yep, right.
Wow. Okay. So, and thank you to you, Jesus, and to Tanya for serving on the subcommittee and putting in that extra work as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you. But again, Jason and staff are the crafters.
You know, I'd like to echo that, though. Dr. Dominguez and Ms. McMillian have been very patient with their schedules and flexible, providing, you know, their availability to us. I was hesitant to try and get them to do something so far as to commit to a specific time every week between now and the December meeting. But they did it, and they did it without complaint. It was amazing.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So, moving forward, I think it looks like we need to take some public comment on this. Let's do that first. So, moderator, can you please facilitate any public comment?
This is the moderator. I am opening up the Q&A feature. The instructions are now on your screen for your reference. Members of the public, if you would like to participate, click on the Q&A icon, which is typically located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. It is a question mark inside of a box. When you click that, it will open a text box in which you can type in, I would like to make a public comment, and make sure it goes to all panelists and click send. And when prompted, click the unmute me button. So I'm going to pause now to allow members of the public time to access the Q&A feature. Have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay, so before moving from agenda item 5, just an expectation for moving forward. There's still work to be done. A lot needs to be plugged in. I'm wondering, on behalf of the board members, will we get to review, we'll get some time to review the best copy we can before we meet, with the understanding that things are still probably in the works and going to change? Because if we're meeting, that second week in December, I don't know how the other board members feel. Please chime in. But I might like that time, like that weekend before, to kind of go through it before we actually meet. And then if anything changes, of course, talk about that.
So staff's intent is to provide a draft to the full board at least the weekend before the meeting. Perfect. So that you have that review time. In between time, and based on what the committee comprised of Dr. Dominguez and Ms. McMillian decides, there may be even time for us to send a draft out in between. Right? If we've made some significant change and we want the board to just be apprised of what those changes are for review in December, we could do that as well. With the caveat that, here's the draft as it is today. Please, stay abreast, review, what have you. But it could change because we're still working on it.
Yeah.
But that final draft that we want to get to you the weekend before. Having said that, there's still a potential, because of the compacted timeline, that while we provide it to you the weekend before, we might also have to kind of point out some highlights of change that have occurred since we sent it to you the weekend before.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
To have you point out what's changed from the draft that we were given.
Well, there may be even changes that we're still working on, kind of behind the scenes. It depends on some of the reporting issues that we're having and data collection.
Okay.
We're hoping that that's not the case, but I just want to plan for the unplanned.
Sounds good. Yeah. Okay, so now we are on agenda item number 7, which is another opportunity for public comment on items not on the agenda. And let's have the moderator please facilitate public comment.
This is the moderator. I've now opened the Q&A feature. Members of the public, the instructions are on the screen for your reference. You can participate by clicking on the Q&A icon, which is typically located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. You click on that question mark inside a square, and it will open up a text box in which you can type, "I would like to make a public comment," and you send it to all panelists. And when prompted, click the Unmute Me button. So I'm going to pause now to allow members of the public time to access this feature. Board President, no requests have been submitted. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
And agenda item number 8, agenda items for future meetings. Board members, do you have any items that you would like for myself to consider and board staff to consider for our future meeting agendas?
This is Dale. I don't have anything at this time.
Thank you, Dale.
Just kind of as a reminder, there are a couple parking lot items that we do plan on bringing forward but may be impacted by sunset. A presentation of services by the regulations unit at DCA, a presentation of services by the Deputy Attorney General's office, or the Attorney General's office by our Deputy Attorney General Liaison, Mr. John Gatchett. And then we will pick up on the normal training schedule starting in March.
And so, moderator, can you please facilitate public comment for agenda items for future meetings?
Yes, I am opening up the Q&A. It is now open. The instructions are on the screen for your reference. Members of the public, if you would like to participate, click on that Q&A icon, type "I would like to make a public comment" in the ask field, and send it to all panelists. Board President, I do not see any requests. Would you like me to close the Q&A feature?
Yes, please. Thank you so much. All right. And that is all we have for today. And so we're going to adjourn the meeting. It is 3:15.